Chapter 744. The guards who were guarding the captives ran over when they heard scream. When they saw one of their comrades sunk into the sand from the head down, they rushed over to check on the situation. Who would have thought that something would happen in such a short time? The guards screamed as they rushed to the captives' room. The room where the 5 important figures were locked up was empty. The captives escaped. Someone's snatching the captives. Go after them. They're too fast. We can't catch up. The 5 captives we caught yesterday have been taken away. Quick, inform the chief. Xiao Xian had already sunk into the sand before those people arrived. However, he did not leave. He planned to stay here and observe. After he snuck in, he heard the guards outside talking about the Viper and the Blue Beetle leaders. He wanted to see what these desert bandits were up to. At the same time, he wanted to find out where the person who betrayed Gong Jiarun was. Before Xiao Xian arrived, Gong Jiarun had told Xiao Xian that if he saw the traitor, he should kill him immediately. That way, Gong Jiarun would owe Xiao Xian a favor. As for the sword, Gong Jiarun did not insist. He planned to start anew and believed that he would be able to forge a better sword in the future. As for the previous one, since it was stolen, he did not want to take it back. It was a farewell to the past. The Yinjiao people did not understand Gong Jiarun's feelings. If they lost a good sword, they would definitely think of ways to get it back. There was no such thing as a mood, a new beginning, or an old one. However, since Gong Jiarun did not ask for it, Xiao Xian did not pay too much attention to it. On the other hand, after hearing the report, the atmosphere between the 2 chiefs had turned sour. After hearing the news, Black Sand's gloomy face turned ferocious. He glared at Yiken. You cheated. Black Sand's eyes were suddenly bloodshot, as if they were dyed red. This happened every time he used the power in his body after breaking through the shackles. When he heard the news, Yiken cursed internally. Now that he saw Black Sand in this state, he knew that this discussion could not continue. We didn't do it. Yiken distanced himself from Black Sand and tried his best to explain. He was not stupid. It was not a good thing to fall out with the Sand Snake now. Moreover, he did not know who was being held captive by the Black Sand tribe. It seemed that the Black Sand tribe valued this person. Regardless of anything else, he would not admit to this. Unfortunately, Black Sand refused to listen or believe him. Other than the Blue Beetles, there was no one else here. Furthermore, he had always been wary of the Blue Beetles. When he first heard the news, he suspected that Yiken had already sent people to kidnap those who could forge better weapons. Now, Yiken was playing dumb in front of him. How preposterous! How dare he trick him? I want you all dead. Black Sand swung his thick arm. A sharpened bone spear flew out from his hand and shot straight at Yiken. Yiken, who was prepared for this, swung his sword horizontally in front of him, deflecting the bone spurs that were flying towards him. He roared, I told you it wasn't us. Meeting Black Sand's bloodshot eyes, Yiken's heart skipped a beat. This was probably the after effect of breaking through the shackles. Everyone's symptoms were different. Black Sand's was easily irritable. The most obvious sign of this was his bloodshot eyes. Black Sand was already in a berserk state. He wouldn't listen no matter what was said. Moreover, the relationship between the 2 parties was not harmonious to begin with. The discussion just now was not a pleasant one, which further provoked Black Sand's anger. Without another word, Yiken leaped up and rushed out of the room through the animal skin scale that was used as a cover. He let out a wolf-like howl towards the sky. He was telling his subordinates that the negotiation had failed. Everyone be careful. The Blue Beetle desert robbers who were waiting outside gathered around Yiken. They pulled out their weapons and faced the Sand Snake people who were surrounding them. Bang! The rare wooden door in the desert was kicked to pieces. Black Sand walked out like a tall tower. Every step he took on the sand creaked loudly, as if he wanted to crush the sand even more. The murderous aura emanating from him swept out in all directions. Even the Sand Snakes couldn't help but take 2 steps back. How dare you trick me? Black Sand squeezed the words out from between his teeth. The air he exhaled from his nostrils made him sound like an angry bull. I told you we didn't do it, idiot. Use your brain and think. After Yiken said that, he realized that it was useless to tell Black Sand this. For Black Sand to be able to lead the sand snakes to this point meant that he wasn't a reckless man. Perhaps Black Sand now understood that it wasn't the Blue Beetle who kidnapped those people. He was just venting his anger on the Blue Beetle people. He even wanted to use force to force Yiken to continue the negotiation that failed to reach an agreement earlier. While the two parties were in a tense standoff, none of them noticed that a figure had sneaked into Black Sand's mansion. The figure sat by the window and watched everything outside. Xiao Xian was very interested in the Blue Beetle desert robber group. The pattern on their bodies was a beetle pushing a dung ball. How did they think of using this as a symbol? Blue Beetle? In the desert, most of the beetles were black in color. Even if they were interested in the dung-pushing beetle, they should be called black beetles. Why would they be called blue beetles? Could it be that they've seen sapphires before? Regardless of the truth, the Blue Beetle people weren't in a good situation. Walking out of the house, Black Sand's muscles squirmed and his bones creaked. It wasn't the sound of breaking, but every bone in his body was preparing for the upcoming battle. Wielding his sword, Black Sand took a few large strides towards Yiken. He raised his arm high and twisted his wrist that was gripping the hilt of his sword. The golden light reflected off the blade bloomed with murderous intent as it slashed towards Yiken at lightning speed. With the sound of metal clashing, the sword in Yiken's hand broke. People on the other side of the sea liked to use swords. After the robberies, the desert robbers were now using swords as their weapon of choice. This was especially true for leaders like Yiken. Most of them used swords. But now, the weapon in his hand, which he once thought to be a great weapon, had broken so cleanly. Without looking at the broken sword, Yiken's body was like a fully drawn bow. His ankle twisted on the sand, and his body borrowed the force to take 3 steps back. Each step was more than 2 meters away, avoiding Black Sand's second slash. At the same time, he reached behind him and pulled out a spearhead. This was the weapon he used in his early days. However, the handle of the spear was broken, and he had a new weapon. After polishing the spearhead, he carried it with him and used it as a dagger. The elders in the team said that it would bless him to return safely every time. Now, Yiken wasn't sure if he could return safely. Things had gone beyond his expectations. The sword in his opponent's hand made him wary. Since his second slash didn't hit anyone, Black Sand wasn't in a hurry to continue. He looked at the broken sword on the ground, and then at Yiken's ordinary-looking spearhead. He snickered, his crimson eyes filled with mockery and satisfaction. The spinning sword reflected Yangguang's light at Yiken and the others. Even though it was just a reflection of light, it was enough to make the Blue Beetles' faces change. They had seen with their own eyes how the sword had broken their leader's weapon. Now that the reflected light shone on them, they felt even more pressured. It was as if the blade of a sword was scraping against their bodies. They were so nervous that their palms were sweating. "I'll give you a choice." Black Sand's words were slow, but they carried an irrefutable authority. His bloodshot eyes stared straight at Yiken and the others. "Over at Heavenly Water, do as I say." "And if I refuse?" Yiken asked. "Then you'll have to die. No one can help you now." Black Sand raised his sword and used the tip to point at the patterns on Yiken and the others. The smile on his face made him look even more ferocious. His crimson eyes were filled with mockery. "You can summon the insects on your body, too. Let me tell you, those insects, I'll stomp them to death if they come. I'll stomp on a pair if they come. I'll stomp on as many as they come." Xiao Xian, who was watching the situation unfold, heard this and said silently, "You can't spout nonsense." Black Sand gripped the glowing sword in his hand. He felt as if he had stepped onto the stairs leading to the Holy Gate. He had become stronger and could trample on the opponents he disliked in the past. Yiken frowned. He was thinking of the best strategy to deal with the current situation. However, Black Sand wouldn't give him that much time to think. Rustle, rustle, rustle. The sound of sand sliding was exceptionally clear in such a stagnant atmosphere. A strange feeling suddenly rose in his heart. Black Sand stared at a certain spot behind Yiken and the others. His eyes widened, and the expression on his face seemed to crack. Bit by bit, his expression changed stiffly. The hand holding the sword trembled. The people around them sucked in their breaths too. Their mouths were agape, as if they had seen something horrifying and unbelievable. Yiken, who was guarding against black sand and didn't look behind him, quickly turned back. Not far behind them, a huge blue beetle crawled out from the sand. Chapter 745. Somewhere outside the town, behind a sand dune that wasn't too tall, was one of the dunes closest to the Viper stronghold. There was nowhere to hide if they went any further. Here, Ta and the rest were waiting, keeping an eye on the town's movements. When they saw a burst of sand outside the town, they knew that Xiao Xian had seen them and was about to send them out. That was the signal they had agreed on earlier. The burst of sand came from Sapphire, who was waiting there. Cha-Cha in the sky flew towards the town when it saw the burst of sand. There weren't many large birds of prey in the desert. If Cha-Cha got too close to the group, it would expose their whereabouts. That was why, since they entered the desert, Cha-Cha had been moving freely most of the time. It did not get too close to the group, but it did not stray too far away either, so Xiao Xian could find it in time. After Xiao Xian threw the 5 Gongjia family members out, Cha-Cha swooped down from the sky and took them away. When they flew out of the town, they did not fly towards where Gongjia Run and the rest were. Instead, they flew in a different direction. After shaking off the vipers who were chasing them, they turned back to meet up with Gongjia Run. Gongjia Run explained the situation of the Flaming Horn tribe to the 5 of them. Although his 5 companions were not in the best state of mind, they were still alive and had all their limbs intact. Given enough time to rest and eat, they would recover without any major problems. Gongjia Ren was relieved. It seemed like the Flaming Horn tribe was more powerful than he expected. They had made the right choice. If they could leave safely, Gongjia Ren would help Yinjiao forge weapons in return for Yinjiao's help. Now that they had saved their people, they had no more worries. If they encountered desert bandits again, the Yinjiao people would not have to worry about anything. They waited for Xiao Xian to return. However, after a while, there was a commotion in the town. Xiao Xian did not appear immediately, nor did he send out a signal for help. What should we do? Tua looked at Ta. Should we go there? Although there were beetles, there were still quite a number of vipers. Xiao Xian alone might not be able to withstand the siege. Accidents were bound to happen. No, wait a little longer. Ta raised his hand to stop him. They hadn't received Xiao Xian's call for help. At the same time, something seemed to be wrong in the small town. Xiao Xian had said that he would send out a signal if there were any abnormalities. Since Xiao Xian did not do so, they continued to wait here. After all these years, Ta also knew that Xiao Xian was no longer the ignorant kid who followed behind the team. Xiao Xian definitely knew what to do. They didn't need to do too much. They just needed to follow the plan. Pay attention to your surroundings, Ta said to everyone. They were now in a place with more desert bandits, so they had to be careful at all times. On the other side, in the small city of the Vipers, under everyone's watchful eyes, the giant blue beetle emerged from the sand. Yellow sand slid off its blue carapace, making hissing sounds. Sapphire's back height might only be considered medium-sized among the desert beasts. However, its overall shape was slightly flat and oval, resembling a giant inverted spoon. There wasn't enough space to accommodate it. As the giant beetle gradually emerged from the sand, the low sand house on the ground also collapsed amidst a series of rumbling sounds. The door woven from desert vines also emitted a fragile creaking sound as it collapsed, breaking off one by one. The people standing around had long retreated when they noticed the situation. They distanced themselves from the giant beetle that had appeared out of nowhere. Generally speaking, desert beasts rarely appeared in this area. After all, there were more and more desert bandits stationed here. Desert beasts would be rarer in places with more people, unless it was a more powerful giant beast. Sapphire's appearance had been categorized as the latter type of beast in everyone's mind. Yiken had planned to take a quick glance behind him and continue watching Black Sand. He wanted to ambush Black Sand when he wasn't paying attention. It would be best if he could snatch the sword from Black Sand's hand. However, Yiken didn't expect to see such a scene when he turned around. He was so shocked that he forgot his initial plan of ambushing black sand. Be it the vipers or the blue beetles, they all stared at the pattern drawn on the blue beetle's body. They looked at the beetle on the pattern, then back at the one that had just appeared. Suddenly, they felt incredulous. The vipers exclaimed, "This pattern is real." The blue beetles exclaimed, "This is real." Although every desert bandit group had their own pattern, it was only a wish symbol. They didn't treat it as real. Without faith, how could they believe in a pattern so easily? Take the vipers, for example. If they were to encounter a venomous snake in the desert, their first thought would be to kill it. If such a giant venomous snake appeared before them, they would definitely wet their pants. That was how the blue beetles were feeling now. The earliest batch of blue beetles had experienced the events of their escape years ago. They knew why Yiken and the elders of the desert bandits decided on such a name. Back then, when the desert was in chaos, they escaped. If it wasn't for the blue beetle that scared off the pursuers, they would have been hacked to death long ago. Moreover, the giant blue beetle gave them a lot of good stuff. That was the beginning of the rise of the blue beetle desert bandits. As for those who joined the blue beetle desert bandits later on, although they had heard about it from others, very few of them actually believed it. Some of them thought that it was either fabricated or pure luck. Now, if those who told them the story of the blue beetle were here, they would have screamed, "You're lying. Didn't you say that the beetle was only as tall as a human? What's this thing that's here?" Recalling Black Sand's words, the blue beetles assumed that Yiken had summoned it to help. They no longer cared about the legend. Their gazes towards Yiken were filled with boundless reverence and confidence. So their leader still had a trick up his sleeve. Not only did he summon a giant blue beetle, it was even bigger than the one in the legends. On the other hand, the vipers were horrified. They didn't expect the blue beetles to be prepared. Even Black Sand thought the same. Yiken, who was equally shocked. Yiken, of course, noticed everyone's gaze on him. He was both shocked and afraid. He really didn't summon this one. He had seen a giant blue beetle before, but it wasn't this big. He didn't dare to think about it. If this giant beetle's appearance was a coincidence and it attacked indiscriminately, would the blue beetle's desert bandits need to change their patterns in the future? The appearance of the giant blue beetle changed the atmosphere in an instant. It was like a piece of frozen ice that was suddenly thrown into boiling water, and cracks began to appear. The sudden change in the situation brought about the same change in everyone's mood. Just as the vipers and blue beetles were having mixed feelings, the giant blue beetle's entire body was revealed. Its shovel-like head turned slightly to scan its surroundings. Its gaze lingered on Yiken for a few seconds. Yiken's heart clenched. He knew better than anyone else what was going on. He was afraid that this giant beetle would attack them. However, Yiken soon noticed that the giant beetle had shifted its gaze to Black Sand, who was standing there with a sword in hand. Other than the sound of sand being blown by the wind, there was silence. Everyone was waiting for the giant beetle's reaction. Even though they noticed that the giant beetle's pattern was similar to the blue beetle's desert bandits, they were still suspicious. The next moment, the giant blue beetle moved. It lifted its forelimb that resembled a long scythe and slammed it down on the sand. Unlike the slamming it did when it was hunting the sand lizards, its forelimb was now more extended. Like a black lightning bolt that fell from the sky, it struck the sand diagonally. The burst of air was like an invisible flying arrow. It shot from the point of impact to a certain direction. Wherever it passed, the sand on the sand was pushed to the sides. Yiken stood still. He knew that he wasn't the target of this attack. He turned back to look at Black Sand. That was the true target of the giant blue beetle. This attack alone was enough to make Yiken heave a sigh of relief. Thank goodness the giant beetle wasn't attacking him. When the giant beetle appeared, Black Sand was already on guard. The moment the giant beetle lifted its claw, he was ready to dodge the arrow-like air current. The air current hit the stone house behind Black Sand with a loud bang. The entire stone house shook. Sand, stone chips, and rocks swooshed down. Fortunately, the sandstone house took a lot of effort to build, so it didn't collapse from this attack. However, if there were to be a few more attacks later on, there was no telling what would happen. Black Sand's heart ached for his mansion. He didn't want to fight here. Gritting his teeth, he stepped out quickly and headed to the other side. Sapphire had the same intention. Xiao Xian was still in the stone house. Sapphire regretted its decision to throw him out. No one noticed the two antennae on its head trembling. Due to its previous mistake of almost eating Xiao Xian's target, Sapphire wanted to do something to atone for its mistake. Hence, it put in more effort to focus on that target. As for the others, it didn't even spare them a glance. Swinging its 6 long legs vigorously, Sapphire chased after Black Sand. The sand kicked up by its long legs hit Black Sand painfully. Yiken stopped chasing after Black Sand. He had the blue beetles move away. Noticing some small beetles crawling out from the sand, he hurriedly said, "Don't attack the beetles on the ground. Move away, move away." The people from the blue beetles did as they were told, while the people from the vipers used a stone spear to stab the beetle under their feet into the sand. Soon, there were 2, 3, 10 beetles, and even more beetles appearing around him. The man panicked. He screamed and clenched the stone spear in his hand, stabbing at the beetles on the ground. The more he stabbed, the more beetles there were. The surrounding beetles started to gather. Soon, they were like a small mountain, pushing the man up. His head and eyes couldn't be seen. At first, they could still see the man waving his stone spear and hear his screams. However, as the beetles continued to increase, they couldn't see anything else, and his screams became softer. The black beetles were like a small wave, sweeping the man into it. When the black wave gradually receded, only a skeleton with tattered clothes was left. What little doubt they had was now shattered by this scene. Someone from the viper's side roared. Insects swarm. Like a ladle of water being poured into a burning pot of oil, it exploded with a bang. Insect tide. The insect tide is here. Run. The vipers couldn't care less about the blue beetles. If they encountered an insect tide in the desert, they would usually run away and stay far away. They didn't expect to encounter an insect tide in their lair. No, it was the blue beetles who brought the insect tide here. The blue beetles could trigger an insect tide. This realization made the vipers even more fearful. Make them leave. The vipers shouted at Yiken. Unfortunately, the viper's leader had been chased away by the giant beetle. The people here were no match for Yiken. A group attack, but there were still so many beetles around. They were all man-eaters. To run or not to run, they watched as Yiken beheaded the vipers one by one. The slain ones were quickly devoured by the beetles on the ground. Some of the blue beetles were bitten as well, but Yiken didn't need to say anything. They all gathered around Yiken, including those who were waiting outside the small town and rushed over after hearing the commotion. They all gathered around Yiken. Yiken stared at the densely packed black beetles on the ground, his heart pounding. He wasn't the elders. The elders believed in the totem and believed that the beetle would give them a chance to live a new life. Yiken, on the other hand, had always been skeptical. However, a team needed a spiritual pillar, so when discussing the totem and name, he listened to the elders' suggestions. He wasn't confident about these insects either. Seeing that everyone was coming towards him, Yiken could only brace himself and step forward. Everyone, don't attack the beetles on the ground. Yiken warned again. The person who felt a bite on his leg was about to chop the beetle, but after hearing Yiken's warning, he could only shake his leg to shake the beetle off. To their surprise, the beetles ran away after taking a few steps towards them. They didn't come any closer. It worked. One of the blue beetles turned to look at Yiken. Boss, this was summoned by you? The legendary disaster in the desert had actually helped them so peacefully and even helped them. This was unbelievable. They decided that they would repent properly when they returned. What if they were eaten by an insect tide in the future? Yiken was thinking the same thing, but he was still suspicious. They were slaves who had seen and experienced too much. He still couldn't believe everything that was happening before his eyes. Rumbling noises came from not far away. It was the battle between the giant blue beetle and Black Sand. They had no idea how it was going. You guys wait here. I'll go up and check on the situation over there. Yiken wanted to jump onto the roof of the sandstone house, but before his feet could leave the ground, someone grabbed onto him. No. Boss, I want to follow you. The person who grabbed onto Yiken's arm said anxiously, "Yes, yes. Boss, we'll follow you." The others beside him quickly chimed in. "No need. I'll be fine alone. You guys wait here." Before Yiken could finish, the others wailed and clutched onto Yiken tightly. "No, boss, don't leave us." They wailed so pitifully that it was as if they would be eaten if Yiken left. But that was the truth. Once Yiken left, the beetles who had been driven crazy by their thirst for blood began to attack indiscriminately. The only thing they wouldn't attack was Yiken. As soon as Yiken jumped onto the roof, the little beetles that were wandering around shrank their encirclement and approached. Seeing this, the people below waved at Yiken. "Boss, help!" Some even jumped onto the roof. Yiken leaped down from the roof, and the approaching beetles retreated. This scene wasn't only witnessed by the blue beetles, but also the vipers. The beetles didn't eat Yiken and seemed to be avoiding him on purpose. Realizing this, some of the vipers began to ponder. Life was the most important thing. One of the vipers ran towards Yiken, shouting as he ran, "I'll join you. I'll join the blue beetles." With the first, there would be the second, the third. Although they were worried that their betrayal would anger Black Sand, their lives were more important. Those who followed the blue beetles now wouldn't be eaten by the insect swarm. Plus, Black Sand might not end well. That giant beetle wasn't easy to deal with. Seeing more and more vipers clamoring to join the blue beetles, the blue beetles turned to Yiken and waited for their leader to make the decision. They all knew that the vipers were forced by the insect swarm, but this wasn't a bad thing for the blue beetles. At least for the current situation, it was a good thing. Let's not talk about loyalty. Now, the desert bandits were competing on who had more people. Yiken, who was surrounded by the crowd like a protective umbrella, was feeling rather complicated. Yiken was more surprised than anyone else. It was actually true. Could it be that the protection the elders mentioned was real? Sensing something, Yiken whipped his head around to look at the sandstone house. His gaze swept from the door to the few windows. There was no one else in sight, but plenty of black beetles were swarming in through the windows. Those who wanted to hide in the house changed their minds. "Leader, what are you looking at?" one of the blue beetles asked Yiken. Yiken shook his head. "Nothing." He just felt like someone was watching them, but when he looked over, he didn't see anything. Xiao Xian, who was originally in the sandstone house, had already made his way to Sapphire. Bang! The sand on the sandy ground splashed up like a reverse waterfall. Black Sand gripped his sword tightly and sliced the oncoming sand waterfall. The sand rubbed against the blade, producing a piercing sound. It was like sharp gravel scraping against one's heart, piercing one's eardrums. Black Sand's meridians expanded. Ever since he broke free from his shackles, other than his physical body becoming stronger, every time he used the energy within his body, his strength would increase exponentially. It was like a totem warrior activating his totemic power. However, unlike a totem warrior, although he had seized the power for his own use, he hadn't fully absorbed it. Every time he used that power, his emotions would easily become irritable. Fortunately, he controlled himself and didn't lose his rationality. Although there were side effects, the increase in his strength was undeniable. Black Sand dodged the giant beetle's long claws. The muscles on his arms expanded again, increasing his strength. Black Sand's eyes turned blood red and bulged outwards as if they were about to bleed. He stared at the giant blue figure not far away. 10 fingers gripped the hilt of his sword tightly. His feet shook the ground, and he bent his legs into a squat. His arched back revealed his protruding vertebrae. His joints moved up and down continuously, emitting a series of creaking sounds. In the next moment, he charged towards the giant beetle like a cannonball. The strength of his muscles and bones mixed with the condensed energy within his body. The large beetle raised its 2 front limbs again, intending to use the sand waterfall to block the sword momentum. Just as its 2 long, scythe-like legs were about to touch the sand, Heisha's legs suddenly rotated, and the sand was shoveled into the air. The twisting force caused his body to turn in an instant, dodging the sand waterfall. Meanwhile, Heisha himself appeared at the side of the large beetle, and his fierce killing intent rushed towards the large beetle. Black Sand knew that he couldn't win against the giant beetle in terms of strength. However, he didn't want to give up his territory and run away. He wanted to use the sword in his hand to cut down the giant beetle. However, every time he rushed over, he would be blocked by the giant beetle's sand waterfall. Therefore, he decided to change his strategy. The giant beetle's actions must be because it was afraid of the sword in his hand. Black Sand's confidence grew. His target was the giant beetle's head. Without its head, how could this giant beetle survive? It wasn't like those monsters created by Rock Hill City. Clang! The strong force collided, producing a crisp sound like metal clashing. The force of the vibration transmitted to the bones of the hand holding the sword, producing a cracking sound. Black Sand's two arms were also repelled by the brute force. Black Sand's pupil shrank. He didn't hit. His target was the giant beetle's head. However, when he struck, the beetle seemed to be prepared. It used its other two pairs of legs, and its body spun like a top. In an instant, it turned at an angle. The part that was originally facing the blade changed from its head to its carapace. And the carapace was the toughest part of the beetle's body. The sword in Black Sand's hand actually only left a shallow mark on its back when the blade of the sword slashed at its back armor. After being repelled by the force of the rebound, Black Sand didn't have time to do anything. The carapace had already crashed into him. Bam! Black Sand was sent flying. The strength in his body was already unstable. With this collision, his chi and blood were in turmoil. He spat out a mouthful of blood. Blood also seeped out of his eyes. The failure of the surprise attack and the mark on the carapace had shaken Black Sand's confidence. After sending him flying, Sapphire's two hind legs kicked. Its body, which looked as cumbersome as an armored vehicle, moved forward rapidly on the sand. One of its forelimbs was already lashing out like a whip. Black Sand was still in the air and had yet to land. Without wings, he couldn't dodge even if he wanted to. He had no other choice but to raise his sword to block. Bam! The toothed forelimb swept across like a heavy axe. It shook off the obstruction in the air and slammed heavily on the sword. A powerful force followed Black Sand's hand that was holding the sword hilt and rushed straight to his arm. Crack! After his fingers were broken, the bones in his arm made a crisp, cracking sound. Even the vertebrae on his back were exploding continuously, as if they couldn't hold on any longer. As for Black Sand himself, he was smashed into sand by this blow. The resulting sand flow scattered like water splashes. Chapter 746. The power in Black Sand's body was in disarray. The arm holding the sword was weak, and he had no choice but to switch to another hand. Just as he got up, the giant beetle was already in front of him. It raised its two front limbs and did not give Black Sand any time to breathe. Heisha felt his scalp go numb from the pressure brought about by the large beetle. Every muscle in his body was trembling, and there was no time for him to dodge. He could only raise his arm and place his sword horizontally in front of him, blocking the attack that was already in front of him. Bang! Black Sand was almost completely smashed into the sand. He could not hold his sword steadily. If it was not for the fact that his body was much stronger, anyone else would have been smashed to death. Even so, Black Sand was barely holding on. He did not even have time to breathe. Heisha smelled the scent of death. Previously, he thought that after breaking free from his shackles, he would no longer have such a feeling. But now he felt it. Fear flashed through his scarlet eyes that were oozing blood. He did not want to die. He still wanted to unify this scattered land of desert bandits. He even fantasized about one day taking over Rock Hill City's territory and controlling the entire desert. But now, he could only helplessly endure the fierce and murderous smashes again and again. Sapphire's attack was actually very simple. In the beginning, it did not know the strength of Black Sand's weapon and tested it a few times. But once it confirmed Black Sand and the sword's capabilities, its attack method was very clear. Especially now when Black Sand was weak, Sapphire did not slack off and did not hold back. There were no superfluous movements. It was simple and straightforward. It smashed again and again. After smashing into the sand, Sapphire would pull him up from the sand and smash him again. If one smash did not kill him, Sapphire would smash him a few more times. Just like when Sapphire was chasing after those sand lizards, Sapphire would fish you out first before hitting you again. Unless you were really nailed to death, Sapphire would not relax. This was because many times when Sapphire thought that the prey did not have the strength to stand up and was about to turn it into a ball, it would realize that the prey had escaped. In order to avoid such mistakes, Sapphire's two front limbs did not stop. Rumbling sounds came from the sand. Sandflowers bloomed and fell. Potholes appeared and were flattened. When Black Sand heard the sound of his bones breaking, his consciousness gradually blurred. He could no longer feel the pain in his body. He regretted his decision. He should not have forced the blue beetles into a corner. Otherwise, the blue beetles would not have summoned the giant beetle. Or perhaps, he should have fled the moment the giant beetle appeared. Even if he lost his territory and his subordinates, with his ability and the sword in his hand, he could quickly rebuild a new group of desert bandits in the desert. Even before his death, Black Sand believed that the giant blue beetle was summoned by Yiken. Sapphire finally stopped its attack. Its shovel-like head twitched as if it was thinking of what to do with this person. Its two paddle-shaped antennae moved. It wanted to wrap the prey into a ball, but the prey was too small. It would only be a small ball, even if it was wrapped into a ball. While Sapphire was hesitating, Xiao Xian gave a command. In the end, Sapphire did not manage to turn the Black Sand into a ball. It extended its forelimbs to scoop up the object that had been smashed into the sand and left. After Sapphire left, a swarm of black beetles crawled out from the sand and swarmed towards the unrecognizable person. Heisha had eaten many people before. Even his blood relatives were not spared when he was still on the run. Men, women, the elderly, and children. He had eaten them all. However, he had never thought that he would be eaten by a group of insects one day. The Viper Man, who was huddled in a low sand house, saw the situation through the gap of the half-blocked vent. He shrunk into a corner of the house. He did not dare to go out. Even Black Sand had been eaten by the insects. He would not be able to escape their jaws. At this moment, there were more than 300 people surrounding Yiken. Those at the edge were too far away from Yiken and were bitten from time to time. However, they did not dare to attack the beetles. For one, they were afraid of being bitten harder. For another, they were worried that the blue beetles would kick them to the side to fend for themselves. The blue beetles had always swallowed their pride when they were bitten. There were even some who were fighting for a spot closer to the center. Yiken never knew that he was so popular. Even his own subordinates used to be afraid of him due to his strength. Now, their fear was mixed with respect. He knew what these people were thinking, but he really did not summon the giant beetle, nor did he do anything else. It's retreating. The insect swarm is retreating. Someone shouted from the periphery. It's retreating. It's really retreating. More people were ecstatic. The Viper Man's first thought was their leader, Black Sand. Since the insect swarm had retreated, what happened to Black Sand? Did he win or lose the battle with the giant beetle? The black beetles that were lingering nearby either burrowed into the sand or left immediately. Earlier, there was a sea of darkness, but now there was only sand left. There were also some collapsed sand houses nearby and some gnawed skeletons. Some of the Viper Man took 2 tentative steps outside, but did not encounter any more black beetles. Leader, the insect swarm has retreated. Does that mean the giant beetle has left too? A blue beetle asked Yiken. Yiken pushed through the crowd in front of him and walked out. The others followed closely behind Yiken. Although they did not see the beetles, they were still worried. It was safest to stay by Yiken's side. Yiken paused and continued forward. He jumped onto the roof and peered into the distance. No, it's not. It's still here. Just as Yiken's words fell, the people who had walked far away retreated back. They refused to leave even after being threatened with knives by the blue beetles. The insect swarm hasn't retreated. It's just left and stopped nearby. It seems to be waiting for something. Yiken jumped off the roof and said, "The little beetles didn't leave." In other words, the giant blue beetle was still there. The giant blue beetle had left after black sand. Now that the sounds of fighting could no longer be heard, did black sand run away, or was he killed by the giant blue beetle? No matter which of the two possibilities it was good news for Yiken. He grew increasingly nervous. His Adam's apple bobbed, and sweat mixed with sand slid down his back. His eyes were fixed on his surroundings while his ears listened carefully to the surrounding sounds. Rustle, rustle, rustle. Something seemed to be approaching. It came from beneath his feet. The surroundings were silent. Everyone's hearts were trembling. The sound was getting closer. It seemed like the other party had no intention of hiding its tracks. On the sand, a blue carapace peeked out. Everyone held their breaths. Some wanted to run, but after what happened earlier, they hesitated when they lifted their feet. After a moment of struggle, they retracted their feet. Their bodies began to tremble. The giant blue beetle that appeared before Yiken had no other obvious wounds other than scratches on its carapace. It looked fine. However, the thing it was biting on attracted everyone's attention. It was a sword the one black sand used to hold. If the sword was here, did that mean black sand was dead? Everyone had their own guesses, but they had to admit that those who stayed here were relieved. The blue beetles felt that black sand was no longer a threat. The vipers, on the other hand, believed that black sand would be no match for Yiken without the sword. Hence, their betrayal didn't need to be wary of black sand. Not knowing why the giant beetle appeared here again, Yiken didn't dare to move. He stood there stiffly. He wasn't the one who summoned the beetle. He wasn't sure if the giant beetle would attack him after killing black sand. The giant blue beetle bit on the sword and moved towards Yiken. The people gathered around Yiken quickly retreated. So the blue beetles stood in front of Yiken. Yiken patted them and gestured for them to move aside, leaving Yiken to face the approaching giant beetle alone. Yiken felt the pressure of facing such a creature alone, but he had no choice but to stand here. He watched the approaching giant beetle and thought of a possibility. His gaze was fixed on the sword in the giant beetle's mouth. His heartbeat quickened uncontrollably and his palms were sweating. The giant beetle bit on the sword and approached Yiken. It leaned in as if trying to discern something. Its paddle-like antennae twitched, giving Yiken the illusion that he would be flattened in the next moment. The others didn't dare to breathe too loudly. After a while, the giant blue beetle loosened its grip, and the sword fell to the sand beside Yiken's feet. After dropping the sword, the giant blue beetle turned and left. Yiken looked at the sword beside his feet. He squatted down and gripped the hilt with trembling hands. There were some scratches on the blade, but they weren't deep. The blade wasn't damaged either. Yiken's palm brushed across the blade, wiping away the sand on it. The blade was still shiny, carrying with it a sense of holiness. The sun was still blazing above his head, but the blade was chilly. It was as warm as the sand underground. Lifting his head to look at the blue beetle that was gradually disappearing into the distance, the sunlight reflected off its back was tinged with a faint blue hue. Yiken's hand on the sword hilt shifted from a grip to a support, while his other hand rested on the sword. Lifting the golden-patterned sword with both hands, he knelt on the sand that was heated by the sun and bowed towards the departing blue figure. Seeing this, the other blue beetles knelt down in unison, bowing towards the departing blue figure. At this moment, they seemed to have realized something that they had heard of but never experienced before. It was something called faith. Many of them had ancestors who were slaves. They only heard about the tribe from their ancestors when they were alone. Therefore, they didn't understand the tribesmen's feelings of totem worship. But now they seemed to have touched it. The patterns drawn on their arms, chests, backs, and other places seemed to carry a scorching heat that was branded into their hearts. The patterns that used to be laughable had now become sacred, just like how they were now bowing towards the giant blue figure. Perhaps this bit of faith would be able to support them to survive in the desert. While the blue beetles knelt down in unison, the vipers exchanged glances. Kneel or not? Would they be eaten if they didn't? It was better to kneel. Since they had chosen to join the blue beetles and their leader had knelt, how could they still stand? If they didn't show their loyalty now, when would they? Hence, after the blue beetles, the vipers who had chosen to side with them knelt down as well. Under the worship of hundreds of people, the giant blue beetle left and disappeared under the sand. The little beetles that lingered nearby also left, burrowing into the sand. Soon, they were nowhere to be seen. This time, the insect tide had really retreated. It had completely retreated. When there was not a single beetle to be seen, Yiken stood up with his sword in hand. He stared ahead with a deep gaze, feeling as if he had been reborn. He was beginning to understand what the elders had said. After ordering his subordinates to count those who had chosen to side with them, Yiken walked into the sandstone house. This morning, it was still Black Sand's mansion. Now it had a new owner. However, Yiken didn't think much of this place. He walked toward the stone table. On it was a piece of animal skin that Black Sand had written earlier. On it was written the terms of cooperation. It was a cooperation, but all the terms listed on it treated the blue beetles as slaves. This was also why Yiken didn't agree to it. Before the giant blue beetle appeared, under Black Sand's coercion, the others looked at him and waited for him to make a decision. Perhaps some of them wanted to agree at the last minute and think of a solution after this hurdle. However, Yiken knew that as long as he agreed now, Black Sand would hand over the agreement he had written long ago and return them to their status as slaves. Even if the giant blue beetle hadn't appeared, Yiken wouldn't have agreed. He was even prepared to fight to the death, but he didn't expect. A slight pain came from his palm. Frowning, Yiken wiped the blood on his palm onto the animal skin. Then, he swung his sword and chopped the animal skin into pieces. Walking out of the sandstone house, Yiken lifted his head and looked in a direction. That was where the Sky Waters Desert Robbers' underground palace was located. They had experienced despair and all sorts of hardships. In the future, they would experience even more glorious things. The Desert Robbers' location was going to be a huge storm. Xiao Xian didn't plan to ask about the Desert Robbers' plans. The presence of Desert Robbers would definitely pose a threat to Rock Hill City. Even if the current leader of the Desert Robbers wasn't experienced enough and their strength hadn't really improved, they would pose a threat to other forces in the desert in the future. It would be best if they could restrain Rock Hill City. As for Sapphire, the sacred relic that Yiken and the others worshipped, it was here because Xiao Xian asked it to. Of course, Xiao Xian wasn't just here for the two Desert Robber groups. He had Sapphire fight with Black Sand because he wanted Black Sand to be Sapphire's whetstone. After unlocking Sapphire's fourth lock, Xiao Xian didn't know how capable it would be. He needed to test it out in real combat. Besides, Sapphire lived in the desert. The enhancement and physical changes brought about by the fourth lock were all to adapt to the desert environment. It was suitable for survival here, and there were more beetles around it. It couldn't follow Xiao Xian to Yinjiao's headquarters. If Xiao Xian brought Sapphire out of the desert to other places, Sapphire wouldn't be able to unleash its full potential. Therefore, Xiao Xian didn't plan to bring it out of the desert. This was the most suitable place for it. However, there were still people from Rock Hill City in the desert, as well as many scattered bands of desert bandits. Perhaps the bandits had yet to develop, and their leaders hadn't had enough time to improve, but humans were complex and cunning. In order to survive in the desert, Sapphire needed to understand more. Sapphire could learn all of these through its battle with Black Sand. Although Black Sand had broken through his shackles, which meant he had truly taken over the power his former slave master had given him. However, the power in his body wasn't stable enough. He hadn't developed enough as a whole. Just like a tribesman who had just merged with a fire seed, he hadn't fully absorbed the fire seed's power. Currently, Black Sand didn't have the upper hand against Sapphire. This was why Xiao Xian didn't worry about Sapphire testing the waters. However, Black Sand's sword could cause some damage to Sapphire. Although it wasn't as good as Hang's sword, it was still a sword made by the Gongjiao family. It could be used as a personal signature sword. It wasn't easy to leave a scratch on Sapphire's back. Xiao Xian wanted Sapphire to know that creatures that looked weaker than it could still fight back. They could even use tricks. Sapphire needed to come up with a countermeasure too. When one's power wasn't absolute, one needed to be smarter. The insect swarm was eye-catching enough. Xiao Xian hoped Sapphire could learn more from this experience. This was his first slave. Xiao Xian didn't want it to become cannon fodder in the desert. Fortunately, Sapphire was smart. When it first created the sand waterfall, it looked like it was defending and attacking, but in reality, it was testing black sand and the sword. The sand in the sand waterfall rubbed against the sword, allowing Sapphire to understand the sword's general condition. It could confirm whether it could withstand the attack with its back armor. Once it confirmed that the sword couldn't really hurt it, it seized the opportunity and black sand could forget about escaping. Searching for food in the desert was never easy. Beasts would cherish every opportunity. Hence, black sand couldn't escape even if he wanted to. As for why the beetles didn't attack Yiken, it was because Sapphire told them not to get close to Yiken. With the beetles' abilities, they couldn't differentiate between too many people and execute overly complicated orders. Hence, it was impossible for Xiao Xian to have them all avoid the blue beetles. Hence, he settled for the next best thing, which was to avoid Yiken. Xiao Xian was interested in the blue beetles, but Sapphire no longer remembered them. Xiao Xian couldn't understand the truth. If Xiao Xian wasn't here, the insect swarm would have attacked indiscriminately. In fact, Yiken would have followed in Black Sand's footsteps. After this incident, Xiao Xian told Sapphire to remember Yiken's scent. If it encountered his men in the future, as long as they didn't attack Sapphire, it wouldn't lead the insect swarm to attack Yiken's men. After all, their totem was the blue dung ball-pushing beetle. Since the blue beetles regarded Sapphire as their religion, it was best to let this misunderstanding continue. Outside Viper's small town, skeletons could be seen occasionally. They belonged to people who failed to escape when the insect swarm appeared. Xiao Xian returned to where Yin Zhao's men were waiting. "Are you okay?" Ta and the others hurried over to ask. They heard the commotion in the small town and saw the insect swarm. Ta said that he wouldn't make a move until Xiao Xian gave the signal. As expected, the insect swarm appeared not long after. They didn't dare to step into the area where the insect swarm occurred. They weren't Xiao Xian. They wouldn't be attacked by the insect swarm. Many of the snake tribesmen ran out in all directions. Some ran in this direction, and the flaming horn tribesmen killed them on the spot. Otherwise, they would be exposed. Xiao Xian had the beetles deal with the corpses on the ground. Once they were buried in the sand, there was no trace of them. They couldn't stay here for long. Perhaps the blue beetles would arrive soon to take over the remaining Viper forces. Not many people knew about Xiao Xian's relationship with the insect swarm. At least, the desert robbers didn't know. Perhaps they would find out in the future, but for now, it was best not to tell them. Viper's small town wasn't a good place to rest. It made the 5 captured men nervous. They would rather sleep on the sand than go to the small town. Coincidentally, the Yinjiao people didn't want to be with the desert robbers either. They left and headed out of the desert. Gong Jiaoren and the other 5 were on Sapphire's back. After receiving food and water and applying medicine to their wounds, they felt much better after some rest. Elder Xiao Xian. Gong Jia Can, the oldest of the 5, spoke carefully. "What is it?" Xiao Xian looked at Gong Jia Kansas, that traitor. Gong Jia Can was referring to the traitor of the Gong Jia family. "He's been eaten," said Xiao Xian. He watched as the man was swallowed by the insect swarm. Hearing that the traitor had been eaten by the insects, the 6 Gong Jia members heaved a sigh of relief. At least the traitor had been punished. However, they soon sighed. They were all implicated and forced to come out. Who would have thought that the traitor would betray them and even lead the desert bandits to capture them, only to end up like this? "Why? Do you feel bad?" said Lei. If a Yinjiao member betrayed his own family, he would be hunted down. Even if he escaped far away, we would do everything we could to kill him. Like that person, the one who betrayed his own family and sought refuge with the slave master. "Dao Yu," said To. Yes, that's him. Dao Yu. Even though he sought refuge with the slave master and lived well in the desert, didn't he get killed by Xian in the end? When Lei mentioned Dao Yu, Xiao Xian thought of what happened back then. If it was as he guessed, Dao Yu was considered dead but had not disappeared. He was just alive in another state. Somewhere in the desert, a team of 200 people walked on the sand. Unlike the desert robbers, this team's formation was more unique. The most eye-catching was, of course, the giant golden beast walking in the middle. The giant beast was oval-shaped, but not as flat as sapphire. It was longer, and when it walked, one could see rings of expansion and contraction marks on its back, as if it was made up of several sections. The seemingly heavy back armor armed most of its body, with long legs protruding from its body. There were many legs, supporting the entire body's movements. On the back of this giant beast, there was a metal frame covered with some cloth curtains, blocking Yangguang. It looked like a small house with a person lying on a wide chair. "Have you found the person?" A lazy voice came from inside. A short and fat figure quickly approached the giant beast, wiping the sweat from his forehead. He said respectfully, "Third young master, not yet." Above, the cloth curtains were lifted and a hard, fist-sized fruit core was thrown out, mercilessly smashing towards the man's head. A cold voice followed. "Then hurry up and find him." Chapter 747. After receiving the 6 Gongjiao members, the Yinjiao people did not stay any longer. They left the desert as quickly as possible. Just because they did not encounter any obstacles before, it did not mean that things would go smoothly later on. Just like before, they spent more time traveling at night and would rest during the day. Sometimes, they would sleep less because they were in a hurry. When they were hunting in the forest, the Yinjiao warriors would occasionally stay up all night. They were just not used to the desert environment, so their speed was limited. However, they still had the stamina to travel. On the way back, the Yinjiao people told the Gongjiao members about the Yinjiao tribe's living conditions. Gongjiao Run and the rest had planned to live in a tribe that hunted all day long, hidden in the depths of the forest. They would live in simple houses made of wood and stone, use metal tools they no longer used, wear old, coarse linen clothes, and live with a group of barbaric tribesmen. However, the more they listened, the more they felt that something was amiss. So the Yinjiao people did not live in the depths of the forest. So the Yinjiao people did not only live in simple houses made of wood and stone. So other than hunting, the Yinjiao people also knew how to farm. Their farmlands were not small, and they even reared domesticated animals. So the Yinjiao people had their own trading area, and it was a trading area built like a city. What surprised them even more was the new bronze weapons in the Yinjiao people's hands and Shaoxin's knife of unknown material. In terms of hardness, even the best Gongjiao Run was not confident that his sword could beat Yinjiao's new bronze weapons. Unbelievable. Were these the tribesmen they had imagined? During their conversation with the Gongjiao members, the Yinjiao people noticed that these people's impression of the tribesmen was so backward. This was intolerable. Although their tribe used to be like that, Yinjiao had changed drastically. The Yinjiao people were very angry at Gongjiao Run and the rest's opinion of the Yinjiao people. The 6 people were already stunned by the scene described by the Yinjiao people. When they saw that the expressions of the Yinjiao people weren't very good, they knew that they must have offended these people and hurriedly explained. "I'm sorry, we've been staying in the royal city for a long time, so we don't know much about tribesmen's lives." Gongjiao Run was embarrassed too. The tribesmen he had heard about were really like that. On the other side of the sea, other than the slave masters and nobles who built cities, there were also various organizations and groups that no longer lived as tribes. The 6 Gongjiao members were familiar with these, but for the tribesmen who lived in the depths of the forest far away from cities and maintained a primitive tribal state, what they heard from others was vastly different from what the Yinjiao people described. Perhaps it was just as Hung had said. Yinjiao was a good place. Things there might not be as bad as before. They had always thought that the tribesmen were lacking in metal weapons. Perhaps there would be a shortage of resources when the time came. However, according to Ta, they had hoarded a lot of metal weapons and even robbed a lot of them. Although they didn't have much resources, it was enough for them to fight. Since they knew that the tribe they were going to rely on was not bad, the most important thing was that they would have the opportunity to showcase their talents and have their own forge. That would be enough. The 6 Gongjiao members were looking forward to the new life they were about to live. Their mood improved, and they started to talk more with the Yinjiao people. "The most important thing for you to live here is to master the language here. Not every tribe knows the language there, said Xiao Xian. The Yinjiao people knew the language on the other side of the sea and could converse with the 6 Gongjiao members because Zheng Luo and the other half of the tribe had influenced each other. Moreover, the people Xiao Xian brought along this time also knew some of the language, so they wouldn't be unable to understand the Gongjiao members' cries for help. However, once they left the desert and entered the tribesmen's territory, they would have to do as the Romans do. Indeed, Gongjiao nodded. They had to learn this language. Since they had nothing to do during the journey, the 6 Gongjiao members followed the Yinjiao people to learn the language and writing used by the tribesmen. Sometimes, they would even write on the sand when they rested. The medicine the Yinjiao people gave them was of better quality. Now, the 6 Gongjiao members could walk and jog. However, they had not fully recovered and could not keep up with the Yinjiao people's speed. That was why they were still on Sapphire's back. We'll be out of the desert in about 5 to 6 days, said Ta. 5 to 6 days was not a long time. Gongjiao Run and the rest had spent much longer in the desert, and it was much more difficult. Compared to before, it was much easier now. 5 to 6 days was nothing. Be careful, said Xiao Xian suddenly. Ta and the rest who were drinking water were stunned. We'll run into trouble. Xiao Xian crushed the straw rope in his hand and threw it into the sand. He mixed it with his foot. At first glance, it was difficult to separate the straw shreds from the dry sand. We can't avoid it. As time, it'll be difficult. They might have followed us here. Xiao Xian thought of the Bai Luo he met before. He knew that slave masters who had lived in the desert for thousands of years must have many beasts that were good at tracking. They might even have other methods. It would not be easy to shake them off. After hearing Xiao Xian's words, the rest became serious. Rock Hill City? Asked Ta. It should be them. Anyway, everyone be careful. Gongjiao Run and the rest were puzzled as to why Xiao Xian could predict what would happen. However, seeing how trusting the Yinjiao people were and how serious the atmosphere in the group was, they did not dare to ask questions. After all, it was for their sake. After that, the group became much quieter. The 6 Gongjiao Ren members stopped asking questions because the flaming horns were too focused on guarding their surroundings. They had no time to chat with them. I heard that Rock Hill City created some monsters that can't be killed. Have you guys seen them? Asked Lei. Gongjiao Ren shook his head. We've only seen them once from afar. I don't know if they really can't be killed, but after being cut in half, their upper bodies could still move nimbly. They didn't bleed, and their bodies were black. When they crossed the sea, there was a chaotic battle there. They took a detour and took a boat. They had only seen them once from afar, and it was a very strange scene. The Gongjiao members felt chills run down their spines. It was no wonder Royal City had received news that the battle was not going well. Anyone would be afraid of those monsters. When the Flaming Horn tribesmen heard that these monsters would not die even after being cut in half, and that they could even use their arms to move around as if they could not feel any pain, even if the Flaming Horn tribesmen were mentally prepared, they still felt a layer of goosebumps on their arms. Not even cutting off their heads, asked Ta. I don't know. Gongjiao Ren and the rest really did not know. They had used all their means to avoid the battlefield and their pursuers. They did not pay much attention to the monsters at the time. They did not even have time to run for their lives, let alone observe if the monsters could still move after their heads were cut off. They can, said Xiao Xian. The Yinjiao members and the Gongjiao members all looked at Xiao Xian. Other than Ta, who knew part of the reason, the rest did not know. Those monsters have no internal organs, including their hearts. Their heads are not the core of their bodies. Of course, cutting off their heads will definitely affect them, but they can still move. Xiao Xian continued. That's why if you encounter them, you can first cut off their heads, then their limbs. However, they will not die, so you must be careful. There might be a sneak attack with a severed arm or something. Everyone felt their hair stand on end at Xiao Xian's words. Gongjiao Ren even touched his neck unconsciously. When he heard Xiao Xian say cut off their limbs, he touched his arm again. He felt his hair stand on end. After all, they grew up in a different environment from the Yinjiao people. These words were more impactful to them. Although the Yinjiao members were horrified, they still remembered Xiao Xian's words. Remember, they are just puppets. They are controlled by someone. They have no life, they cannot bleed, they do not feel pain, and they do not have self-awareness. Other than their strong bodies, they're no different from withered wood. The key lies in the person controlling them. If there is a chance, I will kill the person controlling the puppets first, continued Xiao Xian. The Yinjiao members nodded, indicating that they remembered. Since those puppets could not be considered human and were no different from wood, they would treat these dead humans the same way they treated wood. Under everyone's vigilance, they walked for another 2 days. On this day, Xiao Xian heard the cry of an eagle in the distance. It was the cry of a cha-cha. They're here. Xiao Xian looked in a direction. They're fast. Soon, Ta sent someone approaching at a speed much faster than their speed. It was no wonder Xiao Xian said they might not be able to avoid it. The Yinju members were on high alert. In the distance where the sand met the sky, dust began to roll. A giant figure reflected the golden light, the most eye-catching of all. It was a giant oval-shaped beast. From the reflection of the light, one could tell that its entire body was covered in hard armor. There were people on the back of the giant beast, but they were blocked by a cloth curtain, so one could not see who was inside. There were other people around the giant golden beast, all wearing golden armor. They were very similar to the Jinjiao guards Xiao Xian had seen before. Xiao Xian's gaze swept over the people closest to the giant beast. Although they were all wearing armor and gave Xiao Xian a similar feeling to the Jinjiao guards, Xiao Xian was more concerned about the people running on the periphery. Those people were wearing thick cotton clothes and looked very low-key. Even their heads were covered. If they were ordinary people, they would definitely be sweating from wearing such clothes and running so vigorously under such a hot sun. The people wearing golden armor around the giant beast were relatively normal. One could see that they were tired, but these people didn't seem to feel it at all. They didn't seem to be tired at all. It was them. They were the legendary freaks. Only those who no longer had self-awareness, knew no pain, knew no fatigue, and knew no cold or heat could move like a machine. Even the movement of their feet was neat and tidy. If that was all, they would look more like well-trained soldiers. In reality, they were just puppets. Now that they were close, the sand and dust had limited cover. A gust of wind could be seen. There were about 200 people. Among these 200 people, there were 100 people in armor and close to 100 freaks. They were split evenly between the two sides. Seeing that there was a giant beast, the 6 Gongjia members dismounted from Sapphire's back. Sapphire was obviously going to participate in the battle and could not carry them all the time. Moreover, they could walk and run now. They held the new bronze weapons given by the Yinjiao people and stood together. The Yinjiao people surrounded them in the middle. The troop was getting closer and closer, only slowing down when they were 100 meters away. They walked forward a little more before stopping. The people of the Flaming Horn tribe noticed that the 100 people closest to the giant beast could clearly hear the sound of their breathing after they stopped. Even though they were wearing armor, they could see the rise and fall of their chests. Even the giant beast seemed to be panting. When it lowered its head, the sand on the ground was blown up. However, the people standing at the periphery were not even breathing, let alone panting. After they stopped, they stood there stiffly like they were made of wood. Due to the thick linen cloth, their faces could not be seen clearly. However, the Yinjiao people had already guessed that these people were the freaks everyone was talking about. When Sapphire saw the giant beast, it walked to Xiao Xian's side and raised its 2 long forelimbs, looking at the giant beast threateningly. It was difficult for giant beasts to get along with each other. Hand over the Gongjia people. A cold voice came from the back of the giant golden armored beast. They could not see the person's face through the cloth, but they could hear the thick arrogance and disdain in the voice. Without waiting for an answer, the person continued, "Which one of you is Gong Jiaoren? Step forward." Xiao Xian raised an eyebrow. Ta and the rest's expressions changed too. Why did the person only call out Gong Jiaoren's name? However, they did not look at Gong Jiaoren. Xiao Xian waved his hand behind his back, indicating that they did not need to answer. The person waited for a while, but did not receive a reply. His voice lowered again, this time with an obvious threat. "Which one is Gong Jiaoren? If you don't answer, you'll all die." Xiao Xian thought carefully about the voice. It sounded familiar, but it had been too long since they last met. "And who are you?" asked Xiao Xian. "Shut up. You haven't answered the young master's question." An armored man took 2 steps forward, pointing at Xiao Xian as he shouted. Then, a slightly gloomy voice came from behind the cloth on the insect's back. "Second young master, don't waste time. Kill a few people first, and they'll talk." "You're right." It was the same voice from before, but it did not have the arrogance it had when facing Xiao Xian and the rest. It seemed to be afraid of the person who spoke. "Second young master?" Loya City's second young master, Sula? Xiao Xian suddenly remembered this person. When they first entered the desert, they were in Loya City. Loya City's king, Su Luan, had 3 sons. The first young master, Su Ka, second young master, Su Lu, and third young master, Su Gu. They were half-brothers, but their relationship was like fire and water. Back then, it was because of Xiao Xian that Su Gu snatched the spot that should have been Su Li's to go to Beast City. As soon as Xiao Xian spoke, the man on the golden beast's back lifted the cloth curtain and looked down. Then his eyes turned sharp and cold. "Yinjiao Xiao Xian." Every word was squeezed out from the gaps between his teeth. Even Gongjiao Run and the rest could feel the intense hatred. The rest of Yinjiao looked at Xiao Xian, asking with their eyes, "Does this person have a grudge against you?" Even Xiao Xian did not expect Su Lu to remember him. It had been so long, but he still remembered him so clearly. Of course, Su Lu remembered it clearly. If it weren't for Xiao Xian, Su Gu wouldn't have had the opportunity to follow his father to the Beast City. He wouldn't have been qualified to participate in some important affairs, and he wouldn't have had the opportunity to develop to the point where he could compete with him today. Su Lu was a vengeful person. Even if it had been a long time, he would still remember those who had offended him. Of course, he remembered Xiao Xian. While Su Lu and Xiao Xian were confronting each other, somewhere further away, a team similar to Su Li's was also advancing. Even the giant beast was of the same species. A short and fat person trembled and ran to the side of the golden beast. He said to the man on the beast's back, "Third young master, there's news." "Oh, hurry up and tell me. Did the other team find him first?" The man lying on the beast's back casually picked up a fruit and took a big bite, as if venting his anger. The other team had taken the lead again. You could tell that Su Gu was not in a good mood. The short and fat person braced himself and said, "Yes, second young master has found them. However, there are people protecting them. I think they're from the Yinjiao tribe. This is strange. Why would the Yinjiao tribe come here?" Huffed. Su Gu spat out the fruit he had just bitten and tossed half of the crispy fruit away. He shouted, "Come up here and talk." The short and fat man was shocked, but he reacted quickly and climbed onto the beast's back. He looked clumsy, but his movements were agile. He leaped onto the beast's back and came before the curtain. He bowed and said, "We've just received news that the Yinjiao tribe took the Gongjia family members away. Second young master is now fighting for them. Third young master, do you think we should hurry over? If we're too slow, the Gongjia family members will be taken away." The short and fat man waited for Su Gu's reply. He thought it was strange and asked again, "Young master, I'm not going." A voice came from inside. "Yes." Immediately. What? The short and fat man thought he had heard wrongly. Didn't the third young master and the second young master fight fiercely? They had a fight for everything. After all, the lord of Liya City, Su Lin, had said that only one person could inherit his things. Now, among Su Luan's living children, only the second young master, Su Lu, and the third young master, Su Gu, were left. In the past, everyone thought it would be the eldest young master, Su Ka, and the second young master, Su Lu, who would fight for the right to be the lord of Liya City. However, after the desert incident, the lord of Liya City was no longer called the lord of Liya City. Even so, the current Liya City was at least twice as big as before. As for the title of lord, it didn't matter much since they couldn't surpass Rock Hill City. The city was twice as big, with more resources and wealth. They could even be entrusted with important tasks by the Rock Hill City King. This was a huge temptation. Su Luan's decision still didn't change. He said that there would only be one heir and almost all the resources and wealth. Therefore, at that time, many people thought it would be a fight between the eldest young master and the second young master. However, they didn't expect that the eldest young master would encounter an accident during a mission and be killed by people from the other side of the sea. Only the second and third young masters were left. At that time, many people still thought that since the eldest young master was gone, then the second young master would definitely inherit the throne. However, the third young master, Su Gu, rose to power. Now, the two young masters were almost evenly matched. Everything was fiercely fought. If it was in the past, after receiving a mission, once he heard that Su Lu would arrive first, Su Gu would definitely be anxious and urge him to hurry. However, this time, it was different. I said I'm not going, and I'm not going. Didn't you hear me? After a pause, Su Gu said again, slow down. There's no need to rush. Yes. The short and fat man wiped the sweat from his forehead, thinking that the third young master was really hard to please. Just now, he said he wouldn't go, and the next thing he said was to slow down. Would he regret it after a while? No matter what, the team had already slowed down according to Su Gu's request. The originally hurried team now looked like they were taking a stroll, lazy and leisurely. Why are they from the Yinjiao tribe? Su Gu was troubled. If the Yinjiao people came, then the leader was most likely Xiao Xian. To be honest, Su Gu was a little afraid of Xiao Xian. This was something he felt from the beginning in Luoye City. Later on, some things made him even more afraid of Xiao Xian. However, he wasn't willing to give up just like that. That was why he asked the team to slow down. It would be best if the Yinjiao people and Su Li's people were both injured when they arrived. That would save him a lot of trouble. Chapter 748. Under the scorching sun, two groups of people stood facing each other amidst the endless yellow sands. Su Lu glared at Xiao Xian with a murderous glint in his eyes. If possible, he wanted to personally chop Xiao Xian up and feed him to the slaves. However, Su Lu cherished his life. He knew that Xiao Xian was not easy to deal with. Although he hadn't seen it with his own eyes back then, he had heard of the situation in the Colosseum. Su Lu didn't want to take the risk. If he died, the right to inherit Autumnfall would only go to that idiot Su Gu. However, with Su Li's current status, he didn't need to go personally. He was a slave master and had slaves under his command. Ever since the situation in the desert changed, he had also trained some of his better slaves. He only needed to leave the fighting to the slaves while he watched from the sidelines. Not to mention, Su Lu tilted his head slightly to look at a person seated diagonally behind him. This person was dressed in the same way as the silent people outside the group. They were all dressed in grayish-white sackcloth. The only difference was that while the silent people had their heads wrapped in sackcloth, this person only had his head covered by a hood. Only the lower half of his pale face could be seen. When the light was dim, not even a hint of his expression could be seen. In the desert, most people's skin was tanned due to the sun. However, this person looked like he had not seen Yang Guang for a long time. He even gave off a sickly pale feeling. There was more than one person like this in Rock Hill City. Some participated in the Coastal War, while others followed the slave masters. His third brother also had such a person beside him. These people were the ones who controlled the monsters on the outskirts. Although having such people around made him uncomfortable, on the other hand, they were also a protective force. With these people around, Su Lu felt a lot more at ease. The slaves under his command were also slowly being depleted. Glancing at the people behind him, Su Lu felt more confident. He had 100 slaves on his side and 100 monsters on his side. Looking at Yinjiao's side, he counted no more than 50. Comparing the beasts, his beasts were obviously bigger than Xiao Xian's. Moreover, the beetle did not seem to be very powerful. With this comparison, Su Li's confidence increased once again. Hence, Su Li's eyes flashed with viciousness. If it had been anyone else, he might have let them go after they handed over the Gongjia family members. After all, the battle was exhausting and he could not bear to part with his subordinates. Training these slaves was not easy. But Yinjiao people? He would not leave a single one of them alive. He could even bring the Yinjiao corpses back to claim his reward. Sulu pulled on a metal bell beside him. Immediately, a slave came over. 8 armored slaves unloaded the hut from the back of the giant beast and carried it steadily, like a palanquin. They were afraid that their hands would accidentally shake and make the people inside angry. Looking at their practiced movements, they must have done it many times. "Be careful, it's coming," Xiao Xian warned. The hut that was removed from the giant beast's body was only to allow the giant beast to participate in the battle without affecting the people inside. Su Lu sat inside and was carried to the back of the group. The golden-armored people surrounded him while the silent people stood at the front in the outermost circle. Without any worries, the giant golden beast's pants-like teeth moved and let out a howl like a gust of wind. It lifted its upper body and bent its dozens of legs downwards, exposing its abdomen that was almost touching the ground. Although its abdomen was not as heavily armored as its sides and back, it was still hard armor, albeit lighter in color. Then, the golden-armored beast smashed its upper body into the ground like a spiked club. The sandy ground shook violently as if a boulder had fallen or a mountain had collapsed. It was as if a sudden clap of thunder rang in their ears. Those who were close by felt their heads hurt and their chests churn. The 6 Gongjia members felt a sense of oppression. When they were escaping, they had never encountered a giant beast like this. Even if they had only seen it from afar. If they had encountered a giant beast like this, they would have died long ago. After the rumble, waves of sand rose and spread towards the Yinjiao people. The waves spread to the feet of the Yinjiao people. Even those who stood 100 meters away felt their footing become unstable. It was as if they were standing on a small boat in the middle of a storm, swaying and swaying. The giant golden figure stirred up a gust of sand that rubbed against the giant golden beast's armor. It was as if sand was being polished against hard metal, producing a sharp sizzling sound. Gong Jiarun lifted his sleeves to cover his nose and mouth, squinting his eyes into thin slits to prevent the sand from entering his eyes. His slightly wide sleeves flapped under the wind and sand, and his hair was almost blown parallel to the ground. This giant beast was not easy to deal with. Then, what should the Yinjiao people do? Gong Jiaoren looked around. To Gong Jiaoren's surprise, the Yinjiao people did not show any signs of fear or nervousness. It was as if the giant golden beast's performance was nothing more than a normal gust of wind. In reality, that was indeed the case. They were not pretending to be calm. The Yinjiao people really did not think much of the giant golden beast. What's with the pretense? We've even seen the king stoneworm. This giant beast may give Gongjia Run and the rest a lot of pressure. However, to the Yinjiao people who were used to giant beasts, hunting fearsome beasts, and even a few king beasts, they were not affected much. The Yinjiao people only turned to glance at the giant golden beast, then turned their attention back to the masked and silent people. They were more concerned about these so-called monsters. However, the Yinjiao people's silence made Su Lu think they were afraid. That's all you have. Forget it. Hand over Gongjia Run and the rest, and I'll give you time to leave, said Su Lu slowly, as if this was a rare gift. He gave them time to leave, but did not say how much time they would be given, nor did he mention how he would hunt them down. At this, Xiao Xian smiled and looked in the direction of the wind. You think you have an advantage in numbers? You want to bully us with numbers? So what if I do? Sula thought it was normal to bully others with numbers. It was also the safest, and he liked it the most. It would be abnormal if it was the other way around. Nothing. Xiao Xian raised his right forefoot and stomped down. The ground beneath his feet trembled slightly. It was not as strong as the giant golden beast, but it traveled far. The air around them seemed to change slightly with this stomp, as if muffled thunder was coming from under Xiao Xian's feet. The sound was not loud, as if it came from afar, but also from underground. A layer of sand on the ground spread outwards in a circle, expanding rapidly. Soon, it had passed by Su Li's side. The armored men standing around Su Lu felt a gentle gust of wind graze their feet. However, They had the illusion that a cold hand had gripped their feet, sending chills down their spines. The weather was hot, and they had been traveling for a long time, so it should have been very hot. However, they couldn't help but shiver with an ominous premonition. "Young master, something's wrong." Sulu found it strange too. He pulled the cloth aside and looked outside. Suddenly, he shuddered. Beetles! He saw small black beetles appearing on the sand. One by one, they looked like they could be stomped to death. However, more and more beetles appeared. This gave him an ominous feeling. He then looked at the giant blue beetle beside Xiao Xian. Sulu took a deep breath. His fingers trembled and he released the cloth. He swallowed his saliva. His voice was filled with suppressed shock. Insect tide. When did the horrors of the insect tide become known to everyone? When did it spread? In Su Li's memories, even though there were cases of beetles chewing on the corpses of battle beasts in the early days, that wasn't the start of their panic. The true terror that the insect swarm brought upon them started from an incident in the past. Back then, the Snowfield King sent 200 golden armored guards to hunt down Xiao Xian. However, not a single one of them returned. It was said that those who went out to search for the golden armored guards found the skeletons of the golden armored guards somewhere in the desert. All that was left were pale white bones, tattered clothes, and the golden armor that they were so proud of. They were half buried in the sand, filled with the aura of death. Even if one didn't see it with their own eyes, they could imagine such a strange scene just by hearing it from others. Although the rumor was exaggerated, the 200 golden armored guards might not have all died under the insect tide. However, the complete disappearance of the 200 golden armored guards was most likely related to the insect tide. It was also from then on that the insect tide became another disaster in the desert that caused everyone's expression to change. The slaves under Su Li's command were indeed armed according to the famous golden armor guards of Snowfield City. He and Su Gu had done the same thing. The armors on these slaves were also made in the same batch, and Su Luan had distributed them later. It was a fair distribution of resources before the Lord of Loya City chose a successor. Back then, the golden armored guards of Snowfield City, who were as cruel and bloody as a meat grinder, couldn't escape the insect tide. What would happen to his slaves? Su Lu was indeed proud of having a team of slaves armed with golden armor. However, he also knew that there was still a gap between his slaves and the golden armor guards of Snowfield City. As he thought about it, Su Lu felt a chill run down his spine. His teeth chattered. So this was what Xiao Xian meant when he said bully with numbers. The black insects that rushed out from under the sand had formed a tide of insects. As far as the eye could see, the black tide of insects almost blocked most of the view. The black beetles swarmed towards Su Lu like a tidal wave. The armored slaves screamed and slapped away the beetles that pounced on them. However, more and more beetles squeezed through the gaps between their armor and their clothes. The beasts that the slaves rode stomped their hooves in horror, flinging the people off their backs. The originally neat formation became a mess. However, there were exceptions. Xiao Xian looked at the situation with a solemn expression. They're avoiding the monsters. Those beetles, whether it was fresh or rotten meat, would not leave anything behind. However, when faced with the monsters, it was as if they didn't want to get close to them. They were very repulsive and even took a detour when they rushed past them. Compared to the panicked golden armored slaves, the people who were covered in linen standing on the periphery were like wooden blocks. They didn't react to their surroundings at all. Chapter 749. On the vast expanse of yellow sand filled with undulations and folds, screams of agony and roars of beasts echoed incessantly. The first to suffer were the armored slaves. Black beetles surged out from the sand like a tidal wave. In the blink of an eye, they had surrounded the armored slaves who were standing at the front. Like hungry wolves, the black beetles pounced on them one after another. There were too many beetles. Even if the slaves managed to shake them off, there would still be other beetles swarming in. Even the slightest carelessness would allow the beetles to seize the opportunity to burrow into the armors and gnaw on them. After a frantic roar, a slave in golden armor could no longer hold on. He staggered and fell to the ground. He had just shaken off a wave of beetles and exposed his upper body to the black tide to catch his breath. But in the next moment, he was enveloped again. His face had been gnawed into a bloody mess. The smell of blood stimulated the beetles, causing them to become even more frenzied. There were too many of them. Psychologically speaking, the slaves had already broken down. Strangely, other than the monsters standing at the outermost periphery, the beetles didn't approach the small house surrounded by the cloth tent. Even the slaves who were caught in the tide of beetles were squeezing towards that side. Xiao Xian felt like he was witnessing the same scene that Yiken had encountered earlier. However, the difference was that Yiken wasn't attacked by the beetles back then because of Xiao Xian and Sapphire. The current situation was different, just like how the beetles didn't approach the monsters. Seeing that the beetles weren't coming closer, Su Li's heart calmed down. His greatest fear had been resolved. As long as he was fine, everything was fine. The slaves' deaths made him feel terrible. It wasn't because he was sad, but because the bond between slaves and slave owners would be forcefully severed after a slave's death. The tighter the bond between the slave and the slave owner, the more intense the feeling would be when the bond was severed. These slaves in golden armor were all carefully trained by him. The deaths of the slaves devoured by the beetles were like a hammer to his head. His head hurt, like it was about to split open, and his heart was filled with anxiety. Fortunately, judging from the current situation, the beetles weren't omnipotent. At least, they were useless against those people. Su Li's eyes shone with a vicious light as he roared, "Kill them all!" The golden-plated beast was already charging towards them. It was a beast enslaved by Su Li. Before the changes in the desert, such a beast would have been brought to the bestial battle arena. However, the bestial battle arena had been closed for a long time now. These beasts had also become a part of the battle. There were also the beasts that Su Li would ride on whenever he went out on a mission. "Go," Xiao Xian said to Sapphire. In terms of size, Sapphire was not as large as the giant golden beast, and its tonnage was also a notch lower, but Xiao Xian had faith in Sapphire. The collision of the two giant beasts seemed to have created a storm in the desert. The flying sand and dust made everything on the ground blurry. The strange people who had been standing there silently also began to move. The slaves were too intimidated by the insect swarm to charge forward. Su Li couldn't bear to send his well-trained slaves to their deaths either, so he had no choice but to let the weirdos do it. How could those freaks defeat the Yinjiao people? After all, they still had the advantage in terms of numbers. "Protect them," Ta shouted to the warriors surrounding the 6 Gongjiao members. The Yinjiao people pulled out swords, axes, spears, and other weapons covered in animal hide. When they came to the desert, they brought 2 types of weapons. One was a new bronze weapon, and the other was an ordinary bronze weapon. Most of the time, unless they were dealing with the beasts in the desert, they would only use ordinary weapons. As for the new bronze weapons, they were all covered up. After all, this kind of weapon was too unique, so they had to cover it up. But now that they were going to fight, of course they would not hold back, and there was no need to cover it up. The totemic power in their bodies surged. In the blink of an eye, the Yinjiao people had fully unleashed their auras. Totemic patterns appeared on their bodies. There were no shouts or howls, only silent as they charged forward. When they hunted in the forest, they did not roar often, unless the hunt was nearing its end or under special circumstances, such as a group hunt, or using their roars to chase away beasts. Now, they maintained the same habit in battle. The giant axe in his hand swung mercilessly, colliding with the weapon in the freak's hand. The brute force forced the other party to retreat. The axe-wielding Yinjiao person's shoulders shook to dissipate the force. Then he raised his arm and swung it again. The warrior who was holding the long spear had already replaced the green spearhead. With a shake of the long handle, a hole seemed to have been opened up in the sand. The spearhead was like a sharp fang that locked onto its prey, biting towards the man whose head was wrapped in linen cloth. Ear-piercing sounds of collisions rang out everywhere. The Yinjiao people followed Xiao Xian's advice and attacked the other party's head first. The spear pierced through the throat of one of the masked men, leaving a hole. If it were a normal person, blood would have gushed out of the wound. However, after the masked men's throats were pierced, not only was there no blood spurting out of the wound, but their movements were also not affected. Some of them even used their heads as weapons to attack. It looked like they were prepared to perish together with the masked men. Xiao Xian sighed inwardly. It was just as he had expected. These were people who had died long ago. The ones here were just puppets under their control. They had no sense of pain or consciousness. No matter how strong a beast was, it would still have some self-defense mechanisms in battle. For example, when their vitals were threatened, they would dodge or block. However, these freaks did not seem to know that. Everything they did was to attack, and every attack was filled with killing intent. They cannot be called humans. They were more like killing machines. Xiao Xian pushed off the ground with his right leg and instantly took 2 steps back to avoid the other party's head. These freaks were not afraid of pain. They were fearless and did not have any emotional fluctuations. They would not be affected by the outside world. Even if they were injured, they would not be affected. However, Xiao Xian could not ignore them. He twisted his ankle and stopped his retreat. The knife in his hand descended like a bolt of lightning. It cut through the air with a hissing sound, as if it was rubbing against sand. The blade flashed with a bright light as it beheaded the freak in front of him. Where the other Yinjiao people were, heads wrapped in linen could be seen being chopped off one by one. There was no blood at the cut, only some black, shriveled flesh. The headless freaks only paused for a moment before continuing to attack. It was as if they had not lost their heads, but only a strand of hair. However, if one looked closely, they would notice that these headless freaks were less agile than they had been at the beginning. The experienced Yinjiao people naturally noticed this as well. They were more and more convinced by Xiao Xian's suggestion. Sure enough, it was effective. However, even if this method could have a certain effect, seeing the headless people still standing, as if their movements weren't affected, and they could still continue to fight with their weapons, everyone couldn't help but have a strange feeling in their hearts. Su Lu, who was watching from the sidelines, naturally noticed that the Yinjiao people's actions seemed to be planned. However, compared to that, Su Lu was more concerned about the things in the Yinjiao people's hands. When he saw the green weapons in the Yinjiao people's hands, Su Li's eyebrows shot up. He was so shocked that his jaw dropped. He suspected that his eyes were playing tricks on him. He pulled open the cloth curtain in front of him and stared with wide eyes at the things in the Yinjiao people's hands. He had seen similar green weapons before. However, they weren't weapons that they could use. Apart from a small number of core personnel who participated in the battle near the coast, no one else possessed such weapons. Even his father, Su Luan, only had one. It was said that it was an even tougher weapon. There were very few such green weapons. Even young masters like him might not own one. If they wanted one, they would have to exchange for it with contributions. However, why did the Yinjiao people have them too? Was it possible? Could it be that they just looked alike? In order to find out, Su Lu continued to observe. His focus was on the weapons. As for the Yinjiao people's planned actions, he didn't care anymore. In his opinion, these freaks were immortal. Even if they were dismembered, they would still be able to continue fighting. He didn't think that these freaks would be defeated. Defeated? How is that possible? Even the person sitting quietly behind Su Lu couldn't help but look up when he saw the green weapons in the Yinjiao people's hands. He didn't sit quietly with his eyelids lowered. However, compared to the agitated Su Lu, this person's expression was indifferent. His gray eyes were like a lifeless desert. The sound of metal clashing against metal was ear-piercing. Su Li's heart raced as he watched the weapons in the freak's hands break with every collision. Yes, that's it. Actually, the weapons in the freak's hands were already better than the ones used by the desert robbers. However, these weapons were no match for the green weapons in the Yinjiao people's hands. Su Li's breathing quickened. His original plan was to bring the Gongjia family members back, complete this mission, and reap some benefits at the same time. Who would have thought that he would encounter something so good? Su Lu didn't want to think about how the Yinjiao people got their green weapons. The only thing he wanted to do now was to snatch all the green weapons in the Yinjiao people's hands. There were so many of them. Perhaps he would have to hand in some of them when he returned, but he could definitely keep some for himself. Even if he couldn't keep much, bringing them back would still be a great contribution. Kill. Kill them all, yelled Su Lo. As long as he killed all the Yin Jiao people, everything in the Yin Jiao people's hands would naturally belong to him. The people behind Su Lu had the same thought. Their eyes, which had been calm all this while, suddenly lit up. The attacks of the strange people covered in sackcloth grew fiercer and fiercer. They were already fighting with their lives on the line, but now it was more like a suicidal attack. Fortunately, the Yin Jiao people had already beheaded many of the freaks in the beginning. The situation was alleviated, but even so, these freaks still put a lot of pressure on the Yin Jiao people. Thump! A monster's body was cut in half. His upper body fell to the ground, but his lower body was still moving. After losing his legs, his upper body used one arm as a leg, while the other arm continued to attack the Flaming Horn tribesmen again and again. There was no blood. It was such a brutal scene, but there was no sign of blood. However, under this seemingly bloodless killing field, there was a murderous aura that made one shudder. The 6 Gongjiaoren members watched the battle with shock and fear written all over their faces. They suppressed the churning emotions in their hearts. It was unbelievable. When they escaped from the other side of the sea, just watching from afar was enough to make their scalps go numb. Now, the scene was even clearer than before. It was as if a heavy hammer was pounding on the hearts of the Gongjiao members. Even their hair seemed to be trembling. The freaks who were sliced in half continued to fight. Their heads were chopped off, but their headless bodies continued to attack the Yin Jiao people. Their arms were chopped off, but they could still wield their swords to chop off the Yin Jiao people's legs. These freaks were just like the legends. They were immortal monsters. They knew no fatigue, no pain, no fear, no breathing. Could they win against a group of freaks like this? "Xian, we can't go on like this," shouted Ta. These freaks had the advantage in terms of numbers. They were definitely stronger than these freaks. However, if these freaks couldn't be killed, there was nothing they could do. They had chopped off their arms, legs, and even their heads, but they still caused trouble for them time and time again. Just now, one of their arms had attacked them from behind. Yes, it was just a single arm with a sharp spike in it. If Xiao Xian hadn't warned them to be on guard against ambushes, many of them would have fallen victim to the attack. Who would have thought that they could still cause trouble in that situation? Could it be that he wanted to chop the bones of those freaks into pieces? That would be too tiring. They wanted to attack Su Lu, but the freaks kept them busy. There was no way they could get close. "Help me block the perimeter," Xiao Xian said as he kicked the freak that lunged at him. He could even clearly hear the cracking of the freak's bones. His entire body was slightly deformed, but after landing heavily in the distance, he got up and ran towards them. This was only the beginning. If this continued, it would be disadvantageous to the Yin Jiao people. When Ta, Toa, and the rest heard Xiao Xian's words, they surrounded Xiao Xian with a few other Yin Jiao people nearby. They formed a circle around Xiao Xian. Xiao Xian took a deep breath and held his sword horizontally in front of him. His other hand brushed against the blade, and his thumb was immediately cut open by the sharp blade. Blood flowed from the wound. What is he doing? Gongjiaoren was confused. The rest of the Yin Jiao people didn't understand either, but they just had to follow Xiao Xian's instructions. The Grand Elder must have his reasons for doing so. Chapter 750. The Yin Jiao people had strong healing abilities. Xiao Xian's healing abilities were even stronger. However, he was controlling the wound on his finger to prevent it from healing too quickly. He pressed his fingertip harder on the blade, causing more blood to flow out from the wound. To prevent the blood from dripping onto the ground, Xiao Xian pressed the wound on his thumb against the blade. His finger moved along with the blood flowing out, following the blade towards the tip. TSK, TSK. As Xiao Xian's finger moved, the blade emitted a strange sound. It didn't sound like a finger moving on the smooth blade, but more like the sound of scorching hot metal being branded onto something. Something's not right. What was that? Gongjiaoren was puzzled. What made him even more puzzled was that the smooth blade had a trace of blood sticking to it as Xiao Xian's finger moved. It didn't look like a random smear of blood. Blood wouldn't stick to the blade so tightly, but it was definitely blood. It was the blood left behind when Xiao Xian cut his finger. Gong Jiaren couldn't figure it out. Xiao Xian didn't care about Gong Jiaren's confusion. As the trace of blood neared the tip of the blade, he raised his hand and opened his palm. The totemic power within his body surged. At the same time, another surge of energy followed, as if a switch had been turned on. Within the totemic pattern, a white line danced, moving along his arm until it reached his open palm. Xiao Xian felt a surge of heat flowing wildly on his arm, gathering towards his palm. Whoosh! Flames suddenly erupted from Xiao Xian's raised palm, startling Gong Jiaren and the rest who had been staring at him. What was going on? How could it burst into flames? Su Lu, who had been staring at Xiao Xian, was also shocked. What was that Yin Jiao doing? Also, what kind of metal weapon was that blade in Xiao Xian's hand? Why hadn't he seen it before? It wasn't green either, but it definitely wasn't an ordinary metal weapon. What Su Lu didn't notice was that the hooded man behind him shuddered the moment the flames emerged from Xiao Xian's hands. It was as if he had seen something completely unexpected. Xiao Xian, who was the center of everyone's attention, raised his flaming palm and slapped the tip of the knife where the blood had stopped. The moment Xiao Xian's flaming palm came into contact with the blade, the bloodstain on the blade was like a fuse that was ignited by the flames in Xiao Xian's hand. The burning flame quickly spread throughout the blade. The flame rose up and almost enveloped the entire blade. It looked as if the blade had suddenly burst into flames. The moment the flames spread along the bloodstains and wrapped around the blade, it was as if there was an invisible heat wave that spread in all directions, revealing a majestic aura that shook people's hearts. The sandstorm created by the battle between the two giant beasts seemed to have been blocked by an invisible ball. Beneath their feet was the sand scorched by the scorching sun. At this time, the sun was scorching hot. In the past, Xiao Xian and the others would have found a place to rest. But now, they were under the scorching sun and stepping on the scorching sand. The heat spread from their straw sandals to the soles of their feet. However, this heat wave seemed to be hotter than the sun's rays or the sand that had been scorched by the sun. It was even hotter. Yet, this heat wave didn't make the Yinjiao people feel hot. Instead, it calmed their agitated hearts. The aura of the fire seed, carefully sensing it, it was different from the fire seed's aura they were familiar with. Xiao Xian was using the power of the fire seed, but even the fire seed couldn't ignite a metal weapon. The Yinjiao people weren't the only ones affected by the heat wave. Even the strange people covered in sackcloth paused for a moment under the heat. The hooded person sitting behind Su Lu couldn't help but lean forward, as if trying to get a better understanding of the situation. However, Su Lu didn't notice the reaction of the people behind him. He stared at the knife in Xiao Xian's hand with a gloomy expression. Then he sneered, "Although I don't know what he's doing, it's still futile. Does he think he could take care of these people with a flaming knife?" As he spoke, Su Lu pulled his face forward and said in a low voice, "Kill him and snatch that knife from me." Murderous intent flashed in the eyes of the person behind Su Lu. He directed the strange people to surround Xiao Xian, ignoring the other Yinjiao people. He didn't listen to Su Li's words. In fact, he didn't even hear what Su Lu had said. He was only staring at Xiao Xian. The only thought in his mind was to kill that person. The strange people who were originally fighting the Yinjiao people with missing arms and legs gave up on their opponents and rushed toward Xiao Xian. "Dad!" Xiao Xian shouted at the Yinjiao people in front of him. The sound of a giant beast stomping on the ground rang out. The sand was sent flying high into the air. Those who didn't know what was going on would have thought that a giant beast had charged out from the sand. However, Sapphire and Su Li's giant golden beasts were already fighting under the sand. They weren't here. The one who had caused the commotion was Xiao Xian. Xiao Xian's figure was no longer in his original position. All that was left was a large crater. The sand around the crater fell down, increasing the height of the surrounding area and making the crater even more obvious. Xiao Xian's aura was like that of an excited beast. The sudden explosion of his aura was filled with the usual Yinjiao tyranny. The blood in his body seemed to be on fire. His muscles and bones rumbled under the stimulation of his totemic power. His entire body was charging towards Su Lu in a straight line. Even though he was still far away, Su Lu felt a suffocating sensation in his chest. It was as if someone had covered his mouth and nose. This was a form of suppression. Xiao Xian had locked onto Su Li's position. It made Su Lu feel like he wasn't facing a human, but a ferocious beast. It was as if a tsunami was crashing down on him. Xiao Xian's target was Su Lu. If he wanted to break out of this situation and solve the crisis brought about by the monsters, the first thing he had to do was to get rid of the person who was controlling everything. The solution was a method Xiao Xian came up with after experimenting with the methods of controlling the monsters. The power that controlled the monsters was similar to a fire seed. This power existed within the monster's bones. Because of this, the monsters without organs could still move, even if they were cut in half, or even if they lost their heads. As long as the power within the monster's bones was affected, the control over them would be disrupted or even severed. When a monster charged towards him, Xiao Xian didn't slow down at all. After blocking the monster's attack, he rammed into the monster's arm. It was a brutal charge that was reminiscent of a wild beast in the forest. In terms of physical strength, these monsters couldn't compare to the totemic warriors of the Yinjiao tribe. What's more, Xiao Xian was a high-level totemic warrior. Under the impact, the sound of bones breaking rang out like popcorn popping. The monsters that tried to surround Xiao Xian were knocked away by Xiao Xian. If it was a normal person, they would have loosened their grip on their weapons due to the pain and impact. However, these strange people were different. Their hands seemed to be glued to their weapons. Even if their arms were fractured and deformed, their fingers were still tightly gripping their weapons. They didn't feel any pain. It was as if they were being controlled by someone. It was as if a program was deeply embedded in their bodies, forcing their fingers to stick to their weapons. Even if their arms were chopped off, they would still hold onto their weapons. A flaming saber shadow flashed past, and a headless monster was cut in half at the waist. The upper body of the monster flew into the air, and the lower body slid along the sand for a while before falling to the ground. Gong Jiarun looked at the monster's upper body that flew into the air and landed heavily on the ground. Unlike the monsters that were cut by the Yinjiao tribe, the monster that was cut in half by Xiao Xian was still burning. Although it wasn't much and the fire didn't last long, it was definitely there. What surprised Gong Jiarun even more was that the monster's body that he thought would move again after being cut in half was spasming like it was having a spasm. His arms that had just been raised went limp again. Was this an effect? Gong Jiarun couldn't help but widen his eyes. Behind Su Lu, the hooded man's face turned pale. The muscles on his face were twitching. He felt as if a scorching stream of fire was sweeping through every inch of his muscles, bones, skin, and flesh. It was as if someone had suddenly released a group of crazy, ferocious beasts that were crazily and disorderly charging. His meridians, veins, bones, and even the blood in his blood vessels were screaming in pain. "Stop him! Stop him!" Sula began to panic as he yelled. The slaves were busy dealing with the black beetles. On Xiao Xian's path, the black beetles had cleared a path for him. The slaves who finally had a chance to catch their breath were powerless to stop Xiao Xian. They could only rely on the confused monsters. Ta and the rest also wanted to help Xiao Xian, but Xiao Xian was too fast. They couldn't keep up. Forget the Yinjiao people. Even the other monsters who were surrounding them couldn't keep up. They didn't even have the time to follow Su Lu and the hooded man's wishes. Under the flaming blade, the monsters who were slashed fell to the ground as if they were sick. They spasmed on the ground like machines that had gone haywire. Even if they were standing, they were still shivering from the cold. This scene was extremely strange to the crowd. Why were the monsters who were supposed to be unaffected by the attack acting as if they were sick? Only the hooded man knew that it was because he could no longer control the puppet slaves accurately. There was a force on their bodies that followed the cut left by the flaming blade and spread throughout the puppet slaves' bodies, interfering with his control. It even directly affected the bodies around him that he was controlling. It was the power of the fire seed. It was the power of the Yinjiao fire seed. The power he exerted on the monsters to control them was unstoppable. How could the Yinjiao people have such power? How? How could this be? Aren't those people supposed to be immortal? Su Li's tone changed drastically as he watched Xiao Xian get closer and closer. The hooded figure began to tremble uncontrollably. At this point, it was impossible for Su Lu not to notice. "What's wrong with you?" Su Lu asked anxiously. This person was a shield. If something happened to him, he and his slaves were no match for the Yinjiao people. Besides, the Yinjiao people were related to the insect swarm. Who was that person? The hooded man's voice trembled, as if he was trying to suppress a great pain. His expressionless face twitched as beads of sweat rolled down his forehead. His appearance scared Su Lu. It was obvious that something was wrong with this person, and it was a big problem. Who was Xiao Xian? He's a Yinjiao person from the Yinjiao tribe. Su Lu stuttered. The hooded man obviously wasn't asking about this. He knew that the person was a Yinjiao person, but what was his status in Yinjiao? Why did he have such power? He could feel that not only was his connection with the puppet slaves being disrupted, but it was also being severed one by one. Every time a connection was severed, it felt like a meridian in his body was being severed. The pain was unbearable. His connection with the puppet slaves was much closer than Su Li's connection with his slaves. After all, he was the one who controlled the puppet slaves' every move. He had absolute control over them. On the other hand, the loss of this connection meant that the backlash was even more severe. Why? Why is this happening? Who is he? The hooded man mumbled. His grayish-white eyes stared at the person who was charging towards him. His eyes were filled with fear as he stared at the fiery light that was moving so fast it was hard to follow. "Go!" The hooded man growled. What? Su Lu stared at the hooded man in disbelief. Go! Was this a failure? Why else would he choose to retreat? Go! The hooded man raised his voice, as if he was using all his strength to shout. Seeing that Xiao Xian was about to attack, Su Lu gritted his teeth and whistled. He reached out and scooped up the person behind him. He didn't dare to leave this person behind and escape alone. Otherwise, he would be punished by Su Luan when he returned. With the hooded man in tow, Su Lu rushed out of the tent shack and retreated hastily. As for the remaining slaves and monsters, they were abandoned. It wasn't easy for the two of them to leave, so they couldn't bring those people with them. Although Su Lu felt pity for the slaves, they were nothing compared to his own life. Under such circumstances, he had no choice but to abandon them. Besides, he still needed them to hold off the Yinjiao people and buy them time to leave. Behind Su Lu, there was a loud bang from the sand. The giant, golden-armored beast emerged from the sand with its front body upright and its dozens of legs spread out. When Su Lu and the hooded man arrived, the beast wrapped its legs around each other to form a small, narrow space, protecting Su Lu and the hooded man inside. As for the giant, golden-armored beast, its entire body began to curl inwards from its head, protecting the head and the hooded man inside. In the end, it formed a large golden ball. The parts that were exposed outside were the sturdiest parts of its body. The giant, golden-armored beast wasn't considered to be the type with strong offensive capabilities. It specialized in defense. Back then, Su Gu and Su Lu had chosen this giant beast because of its strong defensive capabilities. In times of crisis, it could form a sturdy protective barrier, protecting them securely inside. Even the sharp fangs and claws of the desert's famous beasts couldn't easily break through the giant golden-armored beast's hard shell. This was the type of beast that could save their lives. The giant golden-armored beast's curled body formed a round ball. The rings of hard shell were tightly connected to each other. There were only a few small gaps that even small beetles couldn't squeeze through. These gaps were for the people inside to breathe easily. The giant golden ball rolled on the sand, kicking up sand that shot out at high speed. It was like the muddy water kicked up by the tires of a car as it rolled across a muddy beach. Xiao Xian avoided the high-speed sand and slashed at the giant golden ball. His blade carried a trail of flames as it collided with the giant golden ball. Screech! The ear-piercing, sound of metal being cut was accompanied by sparks. A long, black scar appeared on the giant, golden-armored beast's body, as if it had been burned. The scar was as deep as a palm. As the giant, golden ball rolled, the black scar expanded to half a circle in the blink of an eye. 2 more slashes, and the giant, golden-armored beast's hard shell would have been cut open. Even though Xiao Xian's attack didn't break through its defense, it was enough to make the golden-armored beast panic. It sped up again, desperately fleeing into the distance. Xiao Xian landed on the ground. His blade-wielding arms were numb from the impact of the slash on the giant golden-armored beast's body. The web between his thumb and forefinger was cracked. He wanted to chase after the giant, golden-armored beast and finish it off, but the beast's defense was too strong. It would take some time to finish it off. However, there were still many weirdos to deal with. Xiao Xian couldn't just abandon the Yin Jiao group. After all, they didn't have a flaming blade. Not everyone had a special ability like Xiao Xian. Bang! A blue figure rushed out from the sand. Sapphire was in the midst of an intense battle with the golden-armored beast when it suddenly ran towards the sand. It rushed out of the sand and looked around. 2 paddle-shaped antennae vibrated, and it moved its 6 long legs to chase after the golden-armored beast. Seeing Sapphire give chase, Xiao Xian temporarily retreated to deal with the remaining weirdos. Even if the person in charge of controlling the golden-armored beast had left, as long as they didn't exceed the effective range, the weirdos would still be a threat. However, as the controller moved further away, their movements would become more sluggish. Chapter 751. In the desert, a team of 200 people was walking slowly on the sand, as if they were taking a leisurely stroll. However, the atmosphere in the team was not the same. A short and stout man looked anxious. From time to time, he would glance at the back of the giant golden beast, waiting for the person above to speak. The sound of footsteps around him seemed to be filtered out. His ears were only waiting for the person behind the curtain to speak. Unfortunately, the silence had been going on for a while. The short and stout man could only wait anxiously. He wiped the sweat off his forehead, took out a water bag made of sea fish skin, and gulped down 2 mouthfuls of water. The water in the water bag was already very hot from the scorching sun. He felt as if his organs were being roasted the moment he gulped it down. It was mostly a psychological factor that caused him to feel this way. With his strength, the water temperature was nothing, but now was the time to be anxious. Even the slightest bit of heat could make him anxious. This man was called Tu Su. He was once a slave master of low status in Whitestone City. He had trained a few desert insects, which he learned from some tribesmen. Back then, the people of the Wanshur tribe had similar techniques. He then combined the techniques of other tribes and created a unique technique to control insects that was suitable for himself. He could use the insects to understand what was happening in places where his eyes could not see. Previously, Tu Su knew that Su Li's team had encountered the Yin Jiao because of this technique. However, most of the time, he knew what was happening over there from the sounds, so he could not see clearly. However, just the sound alone was enough to make it easier for Su Gu to grasp the situation. It was also for this reason that Su Gu protected this person during the battle in the desert. Although Tu Su's combat strength was almost useless, Su Gu only valued his ability to control insects. Tu Su had already told Su Lu about what happened over there. Although he did not know the details, it was true that Su Li's team had been defeated and fled. Previously, Tu Su was still puzzled as to why Su Gu ordered the team, which had already slowed down, to slow down even more once he knew that there were Yin Jiao soldiers there, and that their leader was called Xiao Xian. He even took a few breaks along the way. Now, Tu Su was utterly impressed by Su Gu. If Su Gu had not ordered the team to slow down, they would have definitely bumped into those Yin Jiao soldiers by now. They might even have been implicated by Su Gu. Tu Su was so anxious that he was sweating profusely. On one hand, he was panicking after hearing the news. He was afraid that he would encounter the Yin Jiao as well. After all, Su Gu's team composition was very similar to Su Li's. If Su Lu could only flee in defeat, how strong could Su Gu be? Secondly, After Su Gu learned of the news, he did not let the team change direction. He still maintained the original planned route. Even if they slowed down, if they kept going, would they encounter the Yin Jiao people? Tu Su was perturbed. Tugging on the hat that was covering Yang Guang's face, Tu Su put the water skin away. Just as he was about to ask again, he suddenly heard a commotion in front of him. "What's that?" exclaimed the slave who was walking in front. "Young master, there seems to be." Tu Su paused and did not finish his sentence. He just stared ahead with wide eyes. At the intersection of the desert and the sky, a golden light flashed. Something was approaching quickly, bringing with it a lot of sand and dust. Tu Su was not unfamiliar with this scene. Su Gu had used a similar method before. "A golden-plated beast. Young master, it's a golden-plated beast," Tu Su exclaimed. He was already anxious because of the news. When he saw what was running in front of him, he already had a guess. Although there were other golden-plated beasts in the desert, it was rare to see a golden-plated beast curled up into a ball and fled across the desert. Moreover, Tu Su already knew that Su Li's team was escaping. Hence, the one in front of him could very well be Su Li's golden-plated beast. Su Gu could no longer sit still. He lifted the canopy in front of him and looked at the golden ball rolling towards him. When it got closer, Su Gu was sure that it was Su Li's golden-plated beast. They saw that there were many scratches on the golden ball. They knew how hard the golden-plated beast's shell was. To be able to leave so many scratches on the golden-plated beast's body, it was clear that the opponent was very difficult to deal with. Among them, the most obvious one was a burn mark that was drawn in a large circle. To be able to force the golden-plated beast into such a state, one could imagine the battle situation at that time. It was no wonder that Su Lu did not care about his well-trained slaves. As the golden-plated beast got closer and closer to Su Gu's team, it began to slow down. Although Su Lu and Su Gu were in a state of competition, and both wished for the other to die so that they could inherit Lia's city, under such circumstances, if Su Lu were to call for help, Su Gu would still have to lend a helping hand. This was because there was another person with Su Lu, and he dared not kill that person. However, it did not matter. After all, Su Lu had failed this time. When he returned, he would definitely be punished, and Su Gu would be able to get more resources. Just as Su Gu was thinking about what to do later, the golden ball had already rolled to the front of their team. The golden ball was about to open, but it quickly closed again and rolled to the side. The golden-plated beast under Su Gu's feet began to fret. Boom! The sand rushed up, and the slaves in front hurriedly avoided it. A large blue beetle rushed out from the sand and blocked the direction of the golden-armored beast. Then, with a kick of its two legs, it forcefully kicked the golden-armored beast into the air. The golden ball's rolling momentum was blocked. Not only was it blocked, but it was also kicked in the opposite direction. As a result, a scene like this appeared on the sand. A large blue beetle was standing upside down, using its two hind legs to kick the golden ball in one direction. However, the golden ball did not want to roll in that direction. It tried its best to change direction, and for a moment, the rolling path was twisted and turned. Su Gu was speechless. What was going on? What was this blue beetle that suddenly rushed out? "Young master, that big beetle is with the Yin Jiao people. The insect tide might be brought by it." Tu Su was so scared that his back was covered in sweat. He hurriedly shouted to Su Gu. The moment they heard about the insect tide, Su Gu's slaves trembled. They did not want to stay and feed the insects. Su Gu did not want to stay either. He originally planned to delay until the Yin Jiao people left. Then he would go to the scene of the incident. Now, it seemed that it was impossible. "Retreat. Leave this place immediately." After Su Gu shouted, he looked at the person sitting behind him. He was also wearing a hood. Like the people around Su Lu, he was usually very cold. After Su Gu shouted for them to retreat, that person did not object. In fact, he also wanted to go and see how the puppet slaves were doing, but the situation had changed. They should leave first. "Are the Yin Jiao people here too?" Su Gu asked Tu Su anxiously. Tu Su was about to answer when he suddenly felt his vision go black. His head felt like it was covered by a copper bell, and someone was knocking on it from the outside. It felt like it was going to explode. Tu Su knew this feeling very well. It was because the connection between him and the two winged insects he sent out had been severed. Those winged insects were equivalent to his slaves. There is only one way to sever the connection between him and the winged insects, and that was if the winged insects had died. On the other side, a group of black beetles spread their wings and flew towards the inconspicuous flying insect. The flying insect flew faster than the beetles, but it had lost the opportunity to escape. As more and more beetles surrounded it, its wings were finally bitten. Then a second, a third, and even more beetles surrounded the flying insect and ate it. On the ground, the black insect tide devoured all the golden armored slaves. Some of the slaves tried to escape, but they were cut down by the Yin-Jiao people and swallowed by the insect tide. The Yin-Jiao people tried their best to control the strange people and let Xiao Xian finish them off. This was faster, but they did not get close to the strange people. Almost every bone in the strange people's body could be a lethal weapon. The most they could do was break the bones and slow down their movements. As Su Lu distanced himself from the monster's controller, the monsters were no longer as agile as they were at the start of the battle. Truth be told, if they were separated by such a long distance, the effect would not have been so obvious. However, the hooded figure had suffered from the backlash, and his control over the puppet slaves had weakened significantly. A flaming blade plunged into the chest of a strange person. The strange person pinned to the ground twitched and crackled like firewood being burned. Soon, the strange person would fall to the ground, motionless. That was when the strange people would truly die. Under the impact of the two forces, the bones in the strange people's bodies had changed. If one were to dissect the bones, one would find that there was only some grayish-white powder left in the bones. It looked like the ashes left behind by burning plants. This kind of destruction was irreversible. In other words, they could no longer be controlled and would soon rot, just like those who had truly died. After all the strange people were dealt with, Xiao Xian checked them one by one. After confirming that there were no longer any threats, the Yin-Jiao people heaved a sigh of relief. After letting the others check on the injured, Xiao Xian walked towards the small house that Su Lu had left behind. The small house was surrounded by black beetles. The other Yin-Jiao people did not dare to approach. Only Xiao Xian would not be attacked by these beetles. When he approached, the beetles would even make way for him. When Su Lu escaped, he did not have time to take anything else with him. In the small house, surrounded by curtains, there were two wide lounge chairs, a low table, and a few bottles and jars filled with water and food. Two jars with wide openings were filled with fruits. They looked fresh and juicy. In this kind of weather, who knew how many days they had walked in the desert? It was almost impossible for the fruits to remain fresh unless there was something special that kept them fresh. Xiao Xian found some egg-sized brownish-yellow stones in the jars that held the fruits and food. These stones were not very hard, and Xiao Xian could crush them with just a little force. Every jar that contained food had such a stone. Obviously, this kind of stone was the reason why the food was fresh for a long time. Chapter 752. Xiao Xian didn't look at the rocks for long. He flipped through Su Li's recliner. There was a hidden compartment under the recliner, but there were only some pretty gemstones inside. Su Li might have taken away the important items. Xiao Xian stepped over the recliner and came to the recliner behind it. This was where the person controlling the strange man sat. There was another hidden compartment under the recliner. There were no gemstones inside, only a few bottles. Xiao Xian took a sniff. There were 8 bottles. 4 of them were probably used for healing or other purposes, so they shouldn't be poisonous. The other 4 gave Xiao Xian a bad feeling. They might be poison or something else. Judging from the traces in the hidden compartment, there should have been 10 bottles inside. 2 of them had been taken away, perhaps by the person before they escaped. Xiao Xian removed the hidden compartment and put it aside. He walked around the small house and changed his vision. He scanned the interior of the house. There were no other hidden compartments, but there was another level below the house. In Xiao Xian's vision, there was another person below. He could only see the skeleton, so he didn't know what the person looked like. However, Xiao Xian became alert when he saw the skeleton below. The human skeleton was very bright in Xiao Xian's vision. There was a qualitative difference between the bones of strong and weak people. In Xiao Xian's special vision, the bones of strong people were brighter. The bones below were even brighter than those of Ao and Zheng Luo. Xiao Xian had never seen such bright bones on a human before. The flame on his saber that had just been extinguished reignited. Xiao Xian couldn't help but be cautious. He didn't sense the presence of a living person, nor did he sense any other energy waves. He thought that the strange man was no longer here. But who was the one below? Xiao Xian leaped out of the house. He raised his arm and slashed at the side of the house, close to the ground. He could see the situation inside through the gap. There was a long wooden box inside. It looked like a coffin. The person was inside. There was still no movement. There was a long gap at the bottom of the hut, and the beetles didn't crawl in. The hut seemed to have been sprinkled with medicine, which had the effect of repelling beetles, so the beetles didn't come close. Xiao Xian looked inside for a while, then walked over and pulled out the coffin with his free hand. Strangely enough, the beetles avoided the coffin. They didn't even get close to it. After Xiao Xian dragged the coffin out and put on the ground, the surrounding beetles avoided it. Could it be that this coffin was also sprayed with insecticide? Xian, what's that? Tower and the others did not dare to get close because of the insect horde. They could only watch from afar. Seeing Xiao Xian drag something out from under the hut, the others were also curious. I don't know, Xiao Xian said as he used the tip of his knife to pry open the lid. Inside was a shriveled person. His skin was greenish-black, and his clothes looked strange. They were very simple and tattered. The accessories looked like they had been there for a long time. They would break with a pinch, and it was impossible to tell what they originally looked like. Judging from the clothes and accessories, this corpse should have been left here for a long time. However, this corpse looked similar to the other monsters that had been controlled. Its entire body was shriveled, and there were clear traces of ribs. Its abdomen was sunken, but there were no signs of it being torn open. The other monsters had signs of rupture because their organs were removed, but this one didn't. Was it because the people from Rock Hill City didn't have time to do it? Or did they deliberately not do it? Or was there another reason? A hawk screeched outside. Xiao Xian stopped looking at the person and closed the lid again. This kind of monster was not suitable for Yang Wang. Otherwise, the controllers wouldn't have covered their bodies with thick cloth to hide Yang Wang. Cha-Cha did not participate in the close combat. It had been watching from the sky to prevent others from approaching and attacking them. Now, Cha-Cha warned them again. This time, it was not an enemy attack, but Sapphire's return. Even without Cha-Cha's warning, Xiao Xian could sense it. However, Sapphire looked miserable. Its forelimbs and hind legs were severely injured. One of its forelimbs was missing, and the other was not in good condition either. Its hind legs and forelimbs were in similar condition. There were many impact marks on its back. It was a smooth arc, but it looked like it had been smashed. Sapphire didn't look this bad when it came out of the sand and chased after the golden armored beast. Clearly, this was the result of its continued pursuit. When Sapphire returned, it was pushing a sandball. It liked to roll its spoils into a ball and push it around. When Sapphire pushed the ball upside down, the sandball was slightly taller than it. On the sandball, there were two pieces of golden hard armor that shone brightly under the sun. They were two segments of hard armor from the golden armored beast body. There was still flesh on them. They had been forcefully removed from the golden armored beast's body. Xiao Xian shifted his gaze from the sandball to Sapphire, who was already in front of him. Upon closer inspection, Xiao Xian noticed that Sapphire's shovel-like head was slightly crooked. Its two paddle-shaped antennae drooped down like folded antennae. When Sapphire chased after the golden armored beast, Xiao Xian didn't let it fight to the death. He didn't expect Sapphire to pursue to this extent. Sapphire seemed to be in a hurry to explain something. Due to the connection between their consciousnesses, Xiao Xian could roughly guess why it couldn't bring Su Lu and the controller here. Su Lu and the others had reinforcements. Otherwise, Sapphire wouldn't have ended up in such a sorry state. Sapphire rolled the sandball in front of Xiao Xian, indicating that it wanted Xiao Xian to examine its results. Its two folded antennae swayed anxiously and nervously. Seeing Sapphire's reaction, Xiao Xian smiled. He cut open the sandball with his saber and dug out two pieces of shiny, ring-shaped hard armor from the sandball. There was no one inside, but there were two small bottles. Xiao Xian guessed that they were together with the 8 bottles he found in the hidden compartment of the hut. Perhaps they were dropped when Sapphire was chasing after them. The opening of the bottle was tightly sealed. Xiao Xian examined it. The bottle wasn't broken. The medicine inside had a refreshing smell that refreshed one's spirit. It was probably a healing medicine. Other than these, Xiao Xian also dug out a palm-sized green metal plate from the sandball. There were words engraved on it, the number 22 foot. Putting aside the meaning of this number, the palm-sized metal plate in Xiao Xian's hand was similar to Yin Jiao's new bronze. It was probably made from the blood of a green-faced fanged beast that the people of Rock Hill City had captured. However, its quality was slightly better than that of Yin Jiao's, and it was also more exquisite. Looking at the nervous giant blue beetle in front of him, Xiao Xian asked, "Do you want to unlock the last lock?" Sapphire's two antennae shook. The folded section seemed to lift up, and its hind legs that were missing a section kicked the sand. It was agitated. Xiao Xian didn't intend to unlock the 5th lock so soon. Sapphire had just woken up not long after the 4th lock was unlocked. Unlocking the 5th lock so soon would be risky. Secondly, Xiao Xian thought about it the most. The more slaves he unlocked, the stronger he would become. Many slaves who broke free from their shackles relied on their talents and willpower after unlocking the 2nd and 3rd locks. Sapphire's body was different from the other slaves with 3 locks. When Xiao Xian enslaved it, he placed 5 locks on it. So far, he had already unlocked 4. Xiao Xian didn't know if the giant blue beetle would break free from his control after unlocking the 5th lock. It might even break free from his enslavement. However, he didn't know when he would return after leaving the desert this time. Would the injured Sapphire be targeted by the people of Rock Hill City? What would happen when that happened? Xiao Xian couldn't predict it. He didn't manage to capture Su Li's men this time. With Su Li's vengeful personality, he would definitely do everything in his power to seek revenge. Yin Jiao was too far away from the desert. The possibility of Su Lu leaving the desert wasn't high. Thus, he could only target Sapphire. The insect swarm was too big a target. It wasn't impossible for Su Lu to find Sapphire. He could even set up some traps to lure the swarm. There were many factors to consider. If he wasn't careful, the knife in his hand could become a tool to stab himself. However, Sapphire's performance this time made Xiao Xian decide to unlock the 5th lock. Jiju once said that the loyalty of the first slave was much higher than that of the other slaves. Xiao Xian was willing to take a gamble. Even if Sapphire really broke free in the future, it wouldn't turn against Xiao Xian. Other than Sapphire, Xiao Xian also noticed during this trip to the desert that Sapphire was faintly influencing the other beetles that followed it. There were changes in the swarm. Some beetles were larger than the others. When Sapphire was in hibernation, these beetles led the swarm to sweep the desert. Every time they swept, beetles would die and new beetles would join them. The swarm had expanded compared to before. However, based on the conditions here, the number of beetles in the swarm would eventually fluctuate within a certain range. If there were too many beetles, they wouldn't be able to survive with limited food. However, the future of the swarm still depended on Sapphire. A swarm with a leader was completely different from a swarm without one. A swarm with a leader knew how to coordinate strategically, while a swarm without a leader would be more disorganized and wouldn't survive for long. "I wonder what you'll look like after you're fully unlocked," muttered Xiao Xian as he watched the giant beetle kick its legs excitedly. After the swarm of insects retreated, the Yin Jiao people removed the armor from the slaves that had been beaten to the bone. In Gong Jiaoren's words, these were good materials for forging. The 2 pieces of golden armor that Sapphire brought back were also taken away by the Yin Jiao people. Xiao Xian carried the coffin-like wooden box, planning to study it when he got back. The group didn't stay for long. After a short rest, they left in case the people from Rock Hill City came. When they were about to reach the edge of the desert, Xiao Xian unlocked the fifth lock for Sapphire. Perhaps after unlocking all the locks, Sapphire could become a king beast like other fearsome beasts. Chapter 753. After unlocking the fifth lock, Sapphire burrowed into the depths of the sand and fell into a deep slumber. Xiao Xian didn't know when Sapphire would be able to complete this phase. If everything went well, Sapphire would grow stronger and recover from its injuries. Every time Sapphire woke up from its slumber after unlocking the lock, it would undergo such changes. However, if things didn't go well, not only would Sapphire's injuries be unable to heal, but there would also be negative side effects. The Yinjiao tribe was quite a distance away from the desert. Even if something went wrong, Xiao Xian wouldn't be able to arrive in time. Sapphire could only rely on itself. They didn't encounter many Rock Hill City people along the way. The ones they did encounter were small squads, probably patrolling. When they saw the Yinjiao team, they didn't initiate an attack. Those troops were made up of normal slaves and not monsters. Now that the desert was far away from Rock Hill City's territory, it was rare to see those monsters. Perhaps it was because of the war at the seaside that all of them were transferred there. Hence, Xiao Xian's team didn't encounter much trouble after Sulu. They traveled at night and found a place to rest during the day when it was hot. They were wearing the golden armor they stripped from Su Li's slaves. Before Sapphire was unlocked, it was only used as a porter. After that, the Yinjiao people carried it themselves. The weight of the golden armor was nothing to them. They could even carry it on their backs to hunt sand beasts. Although the armor was indeed useful, wearing it restricted one's movements and one could not get used to it. That was why the Flaming Horns decided to take these armors back and melt them down for recasting. Perhaps they could even make a few decent weapons. "We're finally leaving this godforsaken place," Tower said as he looked ahead. Cha-Cha had already flown out of the desert to find the Yinjiao people waiting outside. They would come to their aid. The sandstorm rose again, blurring their vision. However, they could still sense the approaching Yinjiao people. "Boss! Grand Elder!" Someone ran over. "Did it go well?" "Oh, did you rob them?" The person who came over took the armor. This type of equipment was obviously used by the slaves in the desert. "I ran into some trouble along the way. After I've solved it, I'll take it back with me," Towers said simply. Looking at the strangers in the group, the receptionist asked, "Are they the Gongjia family?" "Yes, that's them." Once they were out of the desert, Ta's mood lightened. He introduced the 6 Gongjia members to the people who were waiting for them. To make it easier for them to understand, to use the language of the other side of the sea. Although it wasn't fluent, at least they could understand. The helper looked at the coffin-like thing Xiao Xian was carrying. He wanted to help Xiao Xian carry it, but Xiao Xian refused. Xiao Xian wasn't sure if this thing was dangerous, so it was better for him to carry it. At least if the person in the coffin was really being controlled, he would be able to detect the energy fluctuations immediately. If it was someone else, it might not be the same. The helper didn't ask any more questions. After receiving them, they wanted to leave this place as soon as possible. Now that their mission was complete, they had to hurry back. They couldn't get used to this place. They felt uncomfortable just waiting outside the desert, let alone those who had entered the desert. Let's go back." Tower and the rest didn't want to stay here for a moment longer. Although they were exhausted from rushing through the desert, they still pushed on. Weeds gradually grew on the sand. They were no longer surrounded by yellow sand. The greenery made their surroundings feel more alive. Not just the Yinjiao people, even the Gongjia members felt like they had been reborn. The desert was a nightmare, and they almost couldn't escape from it. Fortunately, it was all over now. Arriving in a new place, everything was new to the 6 Gongjia members. The air was unfamiliar. The area where the tribesmen lived was very different from where they came from. On the other side of the sea, there were many people coming and going. Therefore, there were often small trails near the cities. Here, however, there were very few people. There were a lot of forests, and some areas with poor soil were completely devoid of people. Only flocks of wild birds could be seen flying around. There weren't many caravans coming and going here. Occasionally, they would see some small traveling teams. Many people were still holding stone tools and horns. Their clothes weren't that exquisite, and they didn't even have gems. Their values were different, so naturally, their accessories were different. When they saw the Yinjiao people, these teams looked nervous. Some of them wanted to rob the Yinjiao people when they saw the gold weapons they were carrying. In the end, they failed and were robbed instead. Later on, to avoid unnecessary trouble, the Yinjiao people used some vines and leaves to weave baskets. They hid the gold armors in the baskets and carried them on their backs. Although they weren't afraid of robbers, they didn't want to waste time on these things. The 6 Gongjia members followed the team and continued forward. They felt much more at ease. It seemed that the tribesmen here weren't much different from what they had imagined, especially the small tribesmen who lived in remote areas. They were still wearing clothes made from plant fibers. Their hair was unkempt, probably stained from searching for food in the forest. Their eyes were vigilant as they watched the Yinjiao team passing by. If the Yinjiao people hadn't told Gongjia Run that these were just small tribesmen, he would have thought they were slaves. Don't underestimate the small tribesmen. There must be a reason why they're still alive. Xiao Xian warned the 6 Gongjia members. The small tribesmen might be behind in terms of material resources, but they might not lose to them in terms of survival. If they were thrown into the desert with the Gongjia members, they would definitely live longer than them. In fact, the Yinjiao tribes weren't much better off than these small tribesmen. When did the tribe start to change? Ta thought about it. It seemed like after Xiao Xian brought them across the river, the change in the tribe was out of control. After witnessing the scene on the road, Gongjia Run and the rest couldn't help but wonder what the Yinjiao tribes were like. What the Yinjiao people described in the desert. Were they telling the truth? The surrounding forest was getting denser and denser, and more people were coming and going. Those people were more particular about their clothes, and their clothes and tools were more complicated. When a road opened up in the forest, the 6 Gongjia members were informed that they were approaching the Flaming River trading point. Gongjia Run understood that there were similar roads near the cities on the other side of the sea. When the traveling teams saw the Yinjiao people, they automatically stepped aside to make way for the Yinjiao people. In fact, this road was wide enough for 2 teams to walk side by side. However, this place had already entered the area of influence of the Flaming Horns tribe. The strong were respected, so they took the initiative to give way, showing a weak attitude. Stepping onto a stone path, the 6 Gongjia members looked at the stone ground beneath their feet and clicked their tongues in wonder. There were no signs of stones joining together. The stone path beneath their feet was a single piece. There were also some petrified flowers and trees near the path. Even the fine thorns on the leaves were clear as day. This is the stone path made by the king beast, asked Gongjia Run. Yes, this is it. Other than the king beast, who else can make something like this? Answered Ta. After receiving confirmation, Gongjia Run was in disbelief. How dare the Yinjiao tribes live here? If they lived on the other side of the sea, they would have evacuated the moment they heard of the king beast. Who would dare to live here like the Yinjiao? What? What is that? Gongjia Kan, who was beside Gongjia Run, lifted his head and looked into the distance. Through the branches, he saw a towering building with a flag-like object fluttering at the top. It was a flaming horn totem. That's the Flaming River Tower, the tallest place in the Flaming River trading point. That's our trading point. The Yinjiao people spoke with pride. Is it really like the city? Exclaimed Gongjia Run, looking at the building. As they got closer, the trading point finally appeared before them. Everyone, welcome to the Yinjiao tribe. Chapter 754. The 6 Gongjia members were led around the streets of the trading point to familiarize themselves with the place. Although the scale of the trading point could not be compared to the famous cities on the other side of the sea, it was still much better than the smaller cities that were built later on. It was clear that the Yinjiao people had put in a lot of effort to build this trading point. However, this was not the end of the Flaming River trading point. According to the Yinjiao people, they would continue to expand. Now that the land had been fenced, it was hard to say how big the trading point would be. Even though it was similar to a city, the environment here was obviously different from the other side of the sea. The shops here were not complicated, and there were not many types of products. It was obvious that they were built in a tribal style. Other than the resting inns, the shops selling fearsome beast meat, horns and fangs were the most crowded places. The place was filled with a more primitive and wild atmosphere. "This is unbelievable. I can't believe it's like this," exclaimed the oldest of the six, Gongjia, Kansas. Although the Yinjiao people had introduced them to the trading point on the way here, they were still shocked when they saw it for themselves. It really was different from the rumors. "Looks like we made the right choice," sighed Gongjia. The others nodded in agreement. This place was much better than they had imagined. They were willing to start a new life in a place like this. They don't have a unified currency here. That's right. Metal wares are rare here, so they barter with other things. Gongjia observed their surroundings carefully. One of the Yinjiao warriors couldn't help but say, "Actually, the Grand Elder has the idea of a unified currency, but he hasn't implemented it yet due to certain reasons." Oh, Gongjia Ren's interest was piqued. He asked, "Then did the Grand Elder mention anything about the currency? Shells? Animal bones? Or animal fangs?" The Yinjiao warrior kept quiet. Before the Grand Elder made the decision, they would not reveal too much. Gongjia could only give up. These Yinjiao people were very stubborn. If they did not want to talk, it would be hard to pry them out of them. However, Gongjia kept this question to himself. While Gongjia and the rest were being led around the trading point, Xiao carried the coffin-like wooden box to the secret underground room. He wouldn't bring something that he wasn't sure if it was a threat to the headquarters, so he could only leave it here. "This is very similar to the monsters in the desert," Zheng Luo said after opening the lid and taking a look. "Similar but different." Zheng Luo remembered what the weirdo from the Hui tribe looked like. Although this one was similar to those shriveled weirdos, there were many differences. "Are they complete?" Zheng Luo asked. Although the person inside was shriveled, there were no wounds on his body. His abdomen was deeply sunken, but unlike those strange people who only had a layer of flesh and bones left, there were still things inside. Perhaps they were shriveled organs. Just like the shriveled flesh on this person's body, those organs might also be shriveled up. He hasn't been controlled yet. Or was there another reason? Zheng Luo was puzzled. "According to what you said, there must be a reason why the slave owner brought him along. I think it's because the person who controlled the weirdos couldn't control this one. Xiao wouldn't bring this corpse into the trading point without any clues. He had tested it several times on the way here. This person must have been strong when he was alive, no weaker than you and AO. His bones are very hard. You know, for Yinjiao's totemic warriors, the stronger they are, the harder their bones are." Of course, Zheng Luo knew this. If a beginner totemic warrior and an advanced totemic warrior hit a stone of the same quality, the former would be injured, but the latter would be able to shatter the stone directly. Increasing one's strength would strengthen one's body, and bones would be a part of it. This person's bones were very hard. Even if he wasn't outstanding in other aspects when he was alive, just the toughness of his bones was enough to measure his strength. This person must have been dead for a long time. Xiao pinched the unrecognizable ornaments on the corpse's body. With just a little force, a cracking sound could be heard. These ornaments should have been very hard when they were made, just like the bones and teeth of the fearsome beasts we use. It's just that some other things happened and a long time has passed, so they've become fragile. Even so, they're still harder than the bones of normal beasts, Xiao explained. Zheng Luo understood what Xiao was trying to say. These ornaments were probably made from fearsome beast bones and were very hard when they were first made. In other words, those fearsome beasts were not easy to deal with. How could the people who hunted them be weak? Yes, different species of fearsome beasts had different degrees of hardness. Perhaps a weaker fearsome beast had tougher bones, but Zheng Luo and Xiao believed in their guesses. They were also a tribe that focused on hunting, so they understood how tribesmen thought. As for ornaments, they preferred the more dangerous and aggressive fearsome beasts. That was the best way to show off their strength and status. The people of Rock Hill City liked to find strong totemic warriors or slaves to make into strange puppets. This one might be one of their targets, but this one is different from the others. Xiao Xian pointed at the person lying in the box. There's some residual power in his bones, similar to the power of the monsters we met in the desert. But it's too little. It can't even control a small piece of bone, let alone a whole person. The residual power must have been left behind by the people of Rock Hill City when they tried to control it. They failed, so they left it until now. Ever since they left the desert, Xiao Xian had not sensed any signs of life from this wooden box. This person should be dead. But how could a lifeless corpse that was not frozen, treated with medicine, or controlled by other forces be preserved in such a state without rotting? Back then, the pterosaur and the other insects had been preserved for so long because they were frozen. So how did this corpse, which looked like it had been dead for a long time without rotting, stay in this state? He did not have the bone ornaments worn by Yin Zhao's ancestors. Xiao Xian, have you tried to control it? Asked Zheng Luo. He knew that Xiao Xian could imitate the people of Rock Hill City and use a similar method to control a corpse. Xiao Xian shook his head. I tried once on the way back, but it didn't work. But I was in a rush and had limited time, so I didn't take it seriously. I'll try again after I settle the Gongjia people down. Zheng Luo also hoped that Xiao Xian could control this shriveled monster. If he succeeded, they would have another ally. Should we send someone to guard this place today? Asked Zheng Luo. Xiao Xian was going to bring the 6 Gongjia people to the headquarters, so he couldn't stay here forever. When Xiao Xian left, they still had to send someone to guard this place, just in case. Do you want me to do it myself? Asked Zheng Luo. No need. I have someone more suitable. Seeing that Xiao Xian had rejected his suggestion, Zheng Luo was curious about who Xiao Xian was referring to. Xiao Xian opened the door to the secret room and walked out to wait for a while. Someone came over. It was the guard at the top of the flaming river tower. The pterosaur was perched on his shoulder. You've gained weight. Xiao Xian compared the pterosaur's appearance before he left to its current appearance. This pterosaur had been living a carefree life while he was gone. Xiao Xian could now control the pterosaur at the headquarters. Although it wasn't as precise as when he was close to the headquarters, it was enough to make the pterosaur fly over obediently. No matter how impudent the pterosaur usually was in front of the Yin Zhao people, it was very obedient now. It raised its head to look at Xiao Xian, then lowered its head as if it didn't dare to approach. A while ago, when Xiao Xian wasn't around, the pterosaur couldn't be controlled due to the distance. Every day, the pterosaur would lead the group of ill-trained bitter leaf birds to steal food from the patrolling soldiers. It would even throw fish bones at them. However, everyone knew that this pterosaur belonged to Xiao Xian. The 2 retired shamans also valued the pterosaur, so no matter how angry they were, they couldn't do anything to the pterosaur. All they could do was scold it. At first, it was useful. Later on, they used words to scare it. Forget about the pterosaur. It didn't even care about the group of birds. Xiao Xian already knew this from the people on duty at the trading point. This is the one you said is more suitable? Zheng Luo looked at the chubby pterosaur in disbelief. What else could it do? It's more suitable than the others. Xiao Xian walked over and grabbed the pterosaur's wings. He carried the unwilling pterosaur into the secret room. He pointed at the cage that hadn't been used for a long time. You'll sleep here tonight. Chapter 755. The pterosaur thought it could finally see the light of day again. It had already gotten used to its new living environment after spending so much time outside. However, Xiao Xian threw it back into this quiet underground secret room. The pterosaur was traumatized by this underground secret room. It had woken up here. In other words, it was here that it was reborn. At the same time, it was also here that Xiao Xian controlled it. It could still vividly remember the fear it felt when every bone in its body lost control. The pterosaur knew it could not resist, so it had no choice but to accept its fate. It cried out a few times to vent its anger, but immediately shut up when it saw Xiao Xian look over. After placing some food and water in the secret room, Xiao Xian and Zheng Luo walked out. The stone door to the secret room was also closed. It's very smart, said Zheng Luo. This was the truth. Even the patrolling warriors who were angered by the pterosaur had to admit this. The creature that looked like a bird was much smarter than most animals. It had a strong learning ability and knew how to avoid harm. It could see the situation clearly. Just like now, it did not want to be locked in this cramped underground secret room. However, it did not dare to resist, so it could only stay inside obediently without any resistance. It's because it's smart and sensitive to danger that I put it in here. Also, when I left the tribe a while ago, it was indeed restless. I have to punish it. It won't be able to leave for the next few days, said Xiao Xian. Knowing that Xiao Xian had a plan, Zheng Luo did not say anything else. He was still very much looking forward to Xiao Xian controlling the corpse. Although Zheng Luo did not go to the desert, he heard from the people who came back about the abilities of the monsters. It was indeed terrifying. Without Xiao Xian, the people who entered the desert might not have made out alive. What do you plan to do with the Gongjia family? Asked Zheng Luo as they walked toward the top of the flaming river castle. On the way here, they said that as long as Yin Jiao accepts them, they would be willing to forge weapons for us. Gongjiaran also said that forging was a part of their lives. They might not be willing to be idle. It's just a win-win situation. However, they also said that the core skills of forging will not be passed on to outsiders. Zheng Luo was a little disappointed to hear that the craftsmanship would not be taught to outsiders, but he could understand. He thought about it. As long as the Gongjia family made things for Yin Jiao, that would be enough. Zheng Luo pointed at the knife in Xiao Xian's hand. Can you mass-produce this kind of metal weapon? With the materials we have now, we can only make about 100 of them, Xiao Xian said. We've already replenished them with new crystals. It will take time to make more. Zheng Luo nodded. 100 was a lot. It was better than he had expected. If these metal weapons were easier to use, new bronze would gradually be replaced. However, truly being replaced was also a relatively long process. It was still too early to think about that now. The material used to forge Xiao Xian's knife was produced from crystals. To distinguish it from other metal weapons, they called it crystal gold. However, the existence of crystal gold was not made public by the Yinjiao tribe. Not many people even knew about it. After leaving the Flaming River Castle, Xiao Xian brought the 6 Gongjia members who had toured the trading point to the headquarters. The great bridge of the Flaming River that looked like it was floating on the surface of the water shocked the 6 Gongjia members once again. They even thought that if there was such a bridge between the 2 continents, they could bypass the battlefield and travel between the 2 continents. However, on second thought, it was good that there was no bridge. Since they had already left the other side, they might not be able to return even if they died. There was no need to keep thinking about the bridge. Freshman, Gongjiaren looked at the mountain in Yinjiao's headquarters. He could see the houses and people moving around on the mountain. The 6 Gongjia members did not raise a high profile when they entered Yinjiao's headquarters. They did not want to attract too much attention for the time being. Perhaps it was because they were on the run that they had developed a habit of keeping a low profile. Since the 6 Gongjia members agreed, Xiao Xian did not insist. He brought them to the place they wanted to visit the most, the forging room. After the cauldron explosion last time, in order to forge the knife in Xiao Xian's hand, they temporarily built a casting room dedicated to forging crystal gold. Although there were new types of gold, the Flaming Horn tribe still mainly used new bronze. A casting room for bronze had to be built, so a new casting room for bronze had to be built. Xiao Xian did not see it before he left. When he returned, he saw a new forging room that was about the same size as the previous one. The 6 Gongjia members discussed this with Xiao Xian. They hoped that Yin Jiao could build a forging room for each of them. The Gongjia family craftsmen would only gather together unless they were called by their masters to teach them skills or when they needed to work together. Most of the time, they liked to stay in their own place and study. Since they started learning how to forge, they spent more time in the forging room than in their bedrooms at home. They could not ask for too much in Yinjiao. Hence, they discussed with Xiao Xian whether he could build 6 forging rooms for each of them. As for the houses, they did not need to build another one. They only needed to build a small house next to the forging room. They could make do with everything else, including living quarters. However, they could not make do with the forging room. Years of obsessive-compulsive disorder would not change in a short period of time. This was not a difficult task for Yin Jiao. After all, this place was big enough. The forging rooms were built according to the design that the 6 of them were used to. With the 6 of them personally watching over the forging room, Xiao Xian did not have to stay there all the time. After making arrangements for the 6 Gongjiao members, Xiao Xian returned to the mountain. He held a small meeting at the top of the mountain and briefly told the others about his trip. He also told them about the ancient corpse he brought back. Like Zheng Luo, the others also hoped that Xiao Xian would be able to control a monster. That night, Xiao Xian stayed at the headquarters and did not go to the Flaming River trading point. At night, in the secret underground chamber of the Flaming River Castle, the pterosaur, who was locked in the secret chamber, finished the beast meat that Xiao Xian had left for him. It was bored, so it used its sharp claws to scratch the ground. Then, it looked at the long wooden box that Xiao Xian had placed on the stone table. It flapped its wings and flew up to the stone table. Because the wooden box was damaged during the process of being transported here, there were gaps of varying sizes even when it was closed. After circling the wooden box, the pterosaur found a slightly bigger gap on the side and squeezed in. If it had just woken up not long ago, it would have been able to squeeze in. However, now that it had grown fatter, it was harder to squeeze in. It was stuck there. Using its mouth and claws, the pterosaur widened the gap and squeezed in with much difficulty. It did not like the smell inside, but it did not feel any signs of life. If it was a corpse that had just died not long ago, it would still eat it when it was hungry. However, the corpse in front of it had been dead for who knows how long. It did not have any appetite at all. Moreover, it had been spoiled during its time in the wild. It did not like the corpse in front of it at all. Instead, it stepped on the corpse and walked back and forth curiously. It pecked at the stones and bones that seemed to have been separated for a long time. After pecking an ornament into pieces, it stepped on the corpse's chest and walked up to the human face. The shriveled face no longer had its original appearance. The protruding cheekbones were more prominent, the eyes were sunken, and all the hair had fallen out. The pterosaur walked on the human face for a while and rummaged through the coffin-like wooden box. It did not find anything that interested it, so it came out from inside. It thought that Xiao Xian would punish it severely. However, it did not expect that it would only be locked up here. There were no other creatures, so there was nothing to worry about. After circling the secret room again, the pterosaur flew back to the cage to sleep. It was active during the day. Its ability to move at night was not as strong as during the day, so it used it to rest. The next day, Xiao Xian went to the trading point from the headquarters. When he opened the door to the secret room, the pterosaur was still sleeping in the cage. It only woke up when it heard the noise. When it saw the food in Xiao Xian's hands, it was completely awake. At this time, it was not afraid of Xiao Xian anymore. With a flap of its wings, the pterosaur glided from the cage to Xiao Xian. Looking around, Xiao Xian found that the secret room was not messed up except for the dragon feces. He threw the meat in his hand to the pterosaur and let it eat it. There were scratches and bite marks on the wooden box on the stone table. When he opened the lid, Xiao Xian saw the ornaments that had been bitten. There were also some footprints on the ancient corpse. Xiao Xian had sensed these last night and knew what the pterosaur had done last night. It was also because he knew that it did not destroy the ancient corpse that Xiao Xian brought it food. While the pterosaur was gnawing on the food, Xiao Xian planned to try to control the ancient corpse. At that time, the pterosaur was still alive, so Xiao Xian did not make a move right away. Instead, he waited until the pterosaur had failed to resist. That was to increase the success rate. Now, Xiao Xian did not need to wait. It was even easier to enslave an inanimate object. However, with the failure on the way back, Xiao Xian was more careful this time. He did not need to worry about robbers jumping out from the surroundings, so he could concentrate more. Raising his hand, Xiao Xian drew out the power of the Yin Jiao fire seed in his body. Similar to the pterosaur, he used the power of the Yin Jiao fire seed to try to control it. Similarly, he did not completely separate the power of the Yin Jiao fire seed from the other power in his body. He allowed them to be drawn out at the same time. This way, the success rate would be higher. With the appearance of the totem pattern, Xiao Xian raised his hand and a flame appeared. He reached his hand above the ancient corpse and slowly pressed it down. He did not know how long this ancient corpse had been stored, but the bones were very active. Otherwise, the people of Rock Hill City would not have brought it along. A corpse without any activity was useless to the people of Rock Hill City. They would have thrown it away long ago. However, since the people of Rock Hill City kept it, it proved that it had a higher value. Because of this, Xiao Xian planned to try a few more times. However, Xiao Xian soon realized that the situation was the same as before. The power of the fire seed could not penetrate deeply. The last time when Xiao Xian enslaved the pterosaur, he did not encounter any resistance. The flame carried the power of the fire seed and directly penetrated the pterosaur's skin and muscles, seeping into every bone. However, this time, Xiao Xian felt a repulsion. On the way back, when Xiao Xian failed, he also encountered a repulsion. However, because he had to take care of the surrounding situation, he could not continue. Xiao Xian did not stop. Instead, he increased the active power in his body, and the flame in his hand grew bigger. The pterosaur had already abandoned its food and retreated to the corner when the flame appeared in Xiao Xian's hand. Now, it even tightened its wings, similar to how it was when it was frozen. Xiao Xian increased the power of the flame. When the flame penetrated the flesh, he could feel a clear resistance. It felt like he was going against the current. However, this was not the case. Every time the flame was about to penetrate the bones, it was as if it had encountered a hard shield and was strongly repelled. The more power the flame penetrated, the stronger the repelling force. After Xiao Xian increased the power of the flame, the feeling became clearer. There was no mistaking it. With such a strong repelling force, Xiao Xian's plan could not be carried out. It was no wonder that the people from Rock Hill City had not succeeded. Dead creatures could not resist. They had no consciousness and could not control their own bodies. However, this ancient corpse was actually repelling the power of Yinjiao's fire seed. How is this possible? However, everything in front of him was real, unless this ancient corpse was actually alive. However, it did not have any signs of life. This confused Xiao Xian because he could not explain it. Xiao Xian retracted his hand and thought for a moment. After a while, Xiao Xian raised his hand again. This time, he used another type of power in his body. He did not use the power of Yinjiao's fire seed. The uniqueness of this ancient corpse was that even though it was dead, the reaction of its bones was similar to that of a living person. The reason why living people were not suitable for this type of controlled enslavement was because of the repelling force of the main body. Not to mention the wanderer slaves, when the other tribesmen were alive, they had the power of the fire seed in their bodies. Even tribesmen who did not merge with the fire seed had the power of totems in their bodies. Totems were another form of the fire seed's power. Totems originated from the fire seed. The fire seed's repelling force would cause it to repel the power of other tribes' fire seeds. This was why Xiao Xian encountered resistance every time he tried to make a move. Therefore, Xiao Xian decided to withdraw the power of Yinjiao's fire seed and use another type of power in his body to try. The reason why Xiao Xian was not strongly repelled by the other tribe's fire seeds was because of this power. This time, a white flame appeared in Xiao Xian's hand, and he pressed his hand down. As Xiao Xian's hand approached, the white flame began to extend downwards, seeping into the ancient corpse's dark, dry skin and flesh. He didn't encounter any obstacles like the previous one, which was like going against the wind. Xiao Xian's heart calmed down a little. It seemed that he had made the right choice. The flame that seeped into the skin and flesh continued to seep in, touching the ancient corpse's bones. Then, the strong repelling force disappeared, as if a solid shield had been removed. It was unimpeded. The high activity of the ancient corpse's bones allowed them to quickly absorb the power of the flame that seeped in. Xiao Xian used his special vision to check. Just like the pterosaur, the ancient corpse's bones seemed to have been dyed white by the flame that seeped into it. However, there was no blood flow. The white color only existed in the bones, and did not seep into the blood vessels and meridians. This was different from the pterosaur. That's right, an ancient corpse was not like the pterosaur. After all, it was a lifeless body. Naturally, there was no blood flow. The blood vessels and meridians were all damaged. The monsters controlled by Rock Hill City were the same. Did he succeed? Xiao Xian retracted his hand and extinguished the flame in his hand. Then he used his mind. The ancient corpse on the stone table did not respond. Xiao Xian frowned. This was not right. Didn't he succeed just now? Why couldn't he control it? He tried a few more times, but the result was the same. He could affect the power that seeped into the bones, but he could not control the ancient corpse like he did the pterosaur. When Xiao Xian tried to control the pterosaur, he also used the same method on other dead beasts. According to his past experience, he should have succeeded by now, but he could not control it. After much effort, he finally managed to seep the power into the bones, but he could not control it. Xiao Xian still could not figure out the reason. He was troubled. Just as Xiao Xian was pondering the reason, Zheng Luo came down to call him. It was Gong Jiarun. He wanted to ask about the forging of crystal gold. Gong Jiarun and the rest had only come into contact with bronze wares. In fact, there were a small number of Gongjia family members who had come into contact with other types of metalwares. Naturally, they knew that there was more than one type of metalwares, but they had never come into contact with them before. That was why they were very interested in new types of metalwares. Before their own forging room was completed, they could not wait to interact with the Yinjiao craftsmen who had participated in the forging of crystal gold. They asked many questions in high spirits, but the Yinjiao craftsmen could not answer them. Gong Jiarun could not resist the temptation. Coincidentally, Duo Kong had brought his hunting results from the headquarters to the trading point, so he followed along. Thinking about the Gongjia family's persistence, Xiao Xian thought about it and decided to explain everything to them. He would definitely stay here for a few more days because of the ancient corpse. This time, he had to explain everything to prevent Gongjia Ren from coming over to ask again. He ordered the Yinjiao warriors to stand guard outside the secret chamber in case anything happened inside. Xiao Xian went to look for Gongjia Ren first. The stone door closed. Other than the ancient corpse on the stone table, there was only the pterosaur huddled in the corner of the room. After Xiao Xian left, the pterosaur cautiously crawled towards the stone table from the corner. It was frightened by the flames on Xiao Xian's hand, but after Xiao Xian left, it became bolder and flew to the stone table to take a look at this strange person. Other than a similar aura to the pterosaur, there was nothing different about the ancient corpse from last night. Losing interest, the pterosaur glided down from the stone table and continued to eat the food it had not finished. As it chewed, the pterosaur suddenly paused, as if uncertain. Its body stiffened as it sensed carefully, then it quickly threw the food away and huddled in the corner again. It folded its wings and carefully peered at the stone table. Thin red lines appeared on the shriveled body of the ancient corpse on the stone table. They intersected like tree branches and gradually spread to every part of its body, growing denser and denser. Those were where the blood vessels and meridians were located. They were also carriers of energy. Xiao Xian did not think this would happen, but now it did. The shriveled and stiff body emitted a faint crackling sound. If one looked closely, they would notice that the skin and flesh on the shriveled parts were changing. However, the changes were not drastic and were not obvious. The sunken parts of the ancient corpse's eyes moved, as if something was rolling underneath. The arms on both sides of the corpse trembled slightly, its fingers moving up and down. At first, it was only 1 or 2 fingers, but soon the 3rd, 5th, and eventually the entire wrist was twisting. Whoosh! The ancient corpse suddenly sat up, scaring the pterosaur that was cowering in the corner. If Xiao Xian was here, he would definitely be surprised. Not only because of the ancient corpse's behavior, but also because the person who sat up had no heartbeat. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.